cloud bridges touch and break. Come together, clutch, release their own symbolic selves. We storm, flash, sing air and sky, moment poems, and nothing lasts longer than this. We storm. Listen. I can't translate the moment of perfect communication. Sidewalk square to butterfly, migration, generation, and generation. A song of heart and curiosity, heart and longing. Spring tree whispers, fig. Other tree spills blossom, pink blossom in the morning. I can't translate the ladybug, the coastal sage, the dance sage, and all of those ceremonies, year and year. We're facing different directions, cousins. Still, we all sing these hillsides together. We still have mirrors to bury. Walking north, I know this water. We should be catching up on old news. Don't worry, I know my way home from here. Repentance is a matter of the heart and not the business of the courts, but conscience seems to be. I know this water, this pebble, the sigh of it. The words are stolen from where they sat, cooling one by one. It was said, this water knows you. We're walking north with the poems I'm burying mirror after mirror for navigation, for poet after poet. You seem to think that you own the minerals in our bones, own these divisions that are so very hard to talk about. Cliches, all of them. The goddess of butterflies is subversive, speaks to all of the corn children, of being dangerous, of being endangered, of flight over distance, of wing beats that will not tire us under this weight of perpetually imagined West, of borders crossed in immigration story. It involves boats sometimes, but it doesn't always include other ways of singing water, of man-made lakes, imposed bridges, of mission buildings reinforced with native bones. These prayers are all made differently. The cornflower that drinks the water, the rose water she spits onto the red cloth, the beads taken to water, held lightly between thumb and forefinger. We sing, we corn children. We understand these war songs, these songs of being invisible to our enemies. We see each other across only this very latest assault among so many, this latest invalidation. We see each other and begin again a new song of remaking. Poem as wall, poem as window, as open door. On the hill near my parents' house, someone built a fence of old doors. It's a San Francisco kind of magic. Less protective than invitation. As borders, as cells, as communities, as wall, as line, the line break, the ways left in, left as invite. Cell wall to keep chemistry in balance, to keep safe, to make safe. Our cells once took in other single cells. Cousins, we're a collection. Each cell a cooperation. The energy that runs through it migrates in, out, across boundaries. Wall of cell contains, constrains, imagination picking at the spaces between the bricks. And culture is as much the ruined walls as it is poems. We're each collective poems. Walls made of laws, anti-miscegenation laws, red line wall, the wall between being woman, being man, walls that define love, marriage laws that define Borders, some scattered, some broken, stale walls, dismantled, unlawed wall, border wall, wall. Poems, art, picking at the space between the bricks. Every wall is a membrane, a conditional invite, a condition, an invite. Witness. It's given to us to witness for each other. Poems, art, picking at the space between bricks. A conditional invite. Witness. We have to witness for each other. Membrane. I rest my forehead against the door to my house. I rest against the door, the invitation, the border, the crossing, the witness. It is a huge honor to have been asked to do this today. It is always an honor to read in Ramaytush territory, and I'm grateful for this moment. Thank you so much.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Tricia Lagasso-Goldberg, co-curator of the Carlos Villa Worlds in Collision exhibition at the Asian Art Museum and the Carlos Villa Roots and Reinvention exhibition at the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery. What an honor it is to start the day with two San Francisco creative giants, Alleluia Panis, acclaimed Filipino-American director, choreographer, and arts leader, also the artistic and executive director of Cool Arts, an internationally recognized contemporary and tribal Filipino arts group, and Kim Shak, a woman of words, of worlds, born in San Francisco, a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and the 2019 San Francisco Poet Laureate. A deep, deep bow to you both. Thank you for sharing your artistry and energy with us as we launch into a day of conversations on Carlos Villa, world-making, and cross-cultural solidarity. Let's give Alleluia and Kim a round of applause to show our appreciation. Okay, here we are, together, again, in person. It's a pleasure to share space with you all today that goes for our panelists and audience alike, to recognize our dear friend, teacher, mentor, and manong, Carlos Villa, to acknowledge his vision, ethos, and pedagogy on the occasion of the West Coast premiere of two exhibitions. First, the Carlos Villa Worlds in Collision exhibition at the Asian Art Museum, and second, the Carlos Villa Roots and Reinvention exhibition at the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery across the Civic Center Plaza. Can I just say we did it, right? I mean, right? Can we just take a moment to bask in this light? You know, first, I just want to say first, you know, Dubs take the NBA championship, right? Gotta snaps on that. And next, we present two exhibitions celebrating Carlos Villa, a San Francisco-born and raised artist at two-storied SF institutions, venues, during Pride Month. I mean, that's a mic drop if I ever heard one. The first, I mean, you know, come on, the first museum retrospective of a Filipino-American artist in history, full stop, right? That's just like incredible. You know, I really think it's time to pop the champagne, time to pop our collective collars and just be hella, hella proud to be San Franciscans, you know? I married into this family. I'm originally from Hawaii, but my husband David is from SF, and I just gotta say, best decision ever. Before we commence with the day's conversations and events, I'd like to acknowledge the institutional partners and funders that made it possible for us to share Manong Carlos's story with you. These exhibitions were co-organized by the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, the San Francisco Art Institute, and the San Francisco Art Commission Galleries. It was funded generously by the Henry Luce Foundation and the Bernard Osher Foundation. The presentation at the Asian Art Museum received support from dear friend and community arts visionary Malu Babylonia. The AAM also received funding for this project from Crisanto and Evelyn Raimundo, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Aikiko Yamazaki and Jerry Yang Endowment Fund for Exhibitions, and the Cal Williams Contemporary Art Exhibitions Fund. SFAI's presentation or participation was made possible with major support from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the National Endowment for the Arts, with additional support from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. And And on behalf of Team Carlos Villa, I'd like to offer my profound gratitude to these partners and sponsors. They really understood the assignment. It really does take all hands on deck to make history. Okay, so I'd also like to give a thanks to the Asian Art Museum, specifically Jay Shu and Abby Chen. I mean, they really understood from the start, as did former SFAI President Gordon Knox and VP of Academic Affairs Jennifer Rissler. They really understood from the start what significance this exhibition and this project really could have for the future and has for us today in remembering Carlos. So thanks especially to the Asian Art Museum for creating space and being a leader, playing a leadership role in the arts by creating much needed space for local Asian American artists like Carlos. And big hug, and I can't see that far, so I gotta do this. I'm at that age where I'm like kind of tromboning with the glasses thing. I gotta say a big shout out and hug to my co-curator, Mark Johnson, the tireless Mark Johnson, who's here for his leadership and generosity. Mark and I have been working together on this project for the last 3 years, and we work so well together that yesterday, during a moment of quiet between events, we went to lunch across the street and started planning a new project. Yeah, gotta say, Mark, you're so fun, and thanks for the last 300 meetings, and I look forward to the next 300 more. Big thanks to Sherwin Rio. I don't know if he's here yet today, but he's here from out of town, from New York. Sherwin is an artist who's actually part of this exhibition, but he's also a scholar and a photo editor in this context. So Sherwin really organized, and we're so grateful for his organization and tracking, scanning, inventorying hundreds and hundreds of images for the Carlos Villa Worlds in Collision book project that was published by UC Press. And is available in the gift shop downstairs along with some other really cool Carlos Villa swag. So check that out, and salamat to Sherwin. I don't want to say too much more, as I'm sure, like me, you're all looking forward to hearing the conversations ahead. I do want to provide a little background and context on Carlos, as some of you might be newcomers to the worlds of Carlos Villa. Carlos was born in 1936 in San Francisco to Ilocano parents from the Philippines. He grew up in the Tenderloin, just blocks from here, the Tenderloin was then home to many Filipinos, particularly bachelors and families who had come to the West Coast to work in U.S. fields and factories. Carlos grew up side by side with his cousin Leo Valador, who was slightly older than Carlos and was Carlos's first art instructor. The story goes like this. Leo, who was enrolled at SFAI at 17 years old, brings Carlos to a party at the Art Institute. At this gathering, Carlos meets artists and characters of all sorts and feels right at home. He picks up a brochure of SFAI and takes it with him while deployed as an enlisted soldier in the Korean War. He thought often of SFAI and was determined to enroll there upon completion of his military service, and that's just what came to be. At SFAI, he studies painting. He asks one of his instructors, Walt Kuhlman, where he can find information on Filipino art and art history, and is told there is none. And that statement really served as as an engine and impetus for change ahead, powering Carlos to search for, inscribe, and create the history that he sought. From there, Carlos became a teacher at SFAI, where he held court for 4 decades, teaching, painting, collage, and a new course he developed titled Worlds in Collision. Worlds in Collision became an umbrella term for a series of classes, symposia, exhibitions, and education-based projects, all centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the arts. I'm going to leave it to the program participants today to take us deeper into Manong Carlos's work and practice as an artist, educator, activist, and community leader. Before I hand the floor over to PJ Gubatina Policarpio, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Asian Art Museum acknowledges that this building is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who were the original inhabitants and indigenous stewards of the San Francisco Peninsula. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So I'm about to pass the mic to PJ. You know, when we first started this project, I formed what I call my dream team of Filipinx-American makers and thinkers to dream up public programming to accompany the Carlos Villa exhibitions. And PJ was one of the team members alongside Leanne Ladia, Jennifer Wofford, and Thea Kire-Tagle. Thank you to these powerhouse creatives and comrades for lending the project your brilliance. And if you don't know PJ, he is the brains behind today's operation, a curator, educator, and style leader. Please help me in welcoming PJ to the stage.
Take this off. Thank you, Tricia. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to keep it brief because I know we want to get to the conversations. But a little bit, Carlos Villa, alongside his work that's on view here today and at SFAC, was a committed convener of critical conversations on art and thought, highlighting always a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, especially as in Other Sources, an American essay in 1976, Sources of a Distinct Majority in the 80s, and Worlds in Collision, as Tricia mentioned, in the 90s and 2000s, which lends the exhibition its title. These conversations have included Moira Roth, Ruth Asawa, Kelly Jones, Amalia Meza Baines, Mary Lovelace O'Neill, Jean Quick to C. Smith, and so many other world makers and path breakers. And so today's program really recognizes and pays tribute to that aspect of Carlos's practice. I hope that we all get a chance to learn something new about Carlos today, whether you've known him for a long time, a student, a friend, a colleague, a peer, or are only beginning to, as Tricia mentioned, enter his world. So today I'm going to introduce the first panelist. I'm going to introduce the moderator, Theo Gonzalez, and Theo will introduce the panelist. Theodore Gonzalez is a scholar of comparative cultural studies. He currently serves as curator of Asian Pacific American History at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, National Museum of American History. Theo has published several works, including Carlos Villa and the Integrity of Spaces, a critical appreciation of Villa's career as an artist, educator, and convener. Generous support for Dr. Gonzalez's work includes recognition as a Fulbright scholar, as well as the senior fellowships at the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, and UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Gonzalez serves as the 21st president of the Association for Asian American Studies and was recently elected to the board of directors of the American Council of Learned Societies. So with that, I'm going to bring up Theo and the panelists panel. Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning. I said good morning. All right, we're off to a great start. Great, I'm happy to be with you this morning. I'll introduce our two panelists. First is Brett Cook, who is an interdisciplinary artist and educator who uses storytelling as a vehicle to distill complex ideas and creative practices to transform outer and inner worlds of being. Using inquiry-based approaches, he designs inclusive processes and products that promote awareness and embody the complexity of loving communities. He has received numerous awards, including the Lehman Brady Fellowship at Duke and at the University of North Carolina, and the Richard C. Diebenkorn Fellowship at the San Francisco Art Institute. Recognized for a history of socially relevant, community-engaged projects, he was selected as a cultural ambassador to Nigeria as part of the U.S. State Department's Smart Power Initiative. His work is in private and public collections, including the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Walker Art Center, and the the Studio Museum of Harlem. Brett is currently the inaugural Senior Fellow of Visual Arts at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and a trustee of A Blade of Grass, a nonprofit dedicated to social engagement. Please welcome Brett Cook. Next up is Dr. Alison Tinchanco Cubales, who is an award-winning full professor in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University and affiliated faculty in the EDD Leadership Program, working with educators worldwide on how to implement culturally and community-responsive pedagogy in their classrooms. For the past 17 years, she's been teaching in the Asian American Studies Department with a focus on Filipino American studies. She's the co-founder and director of Community Responsive Education and the Teaching Excellence Network, two nationwide services that support the development of responsive, equitable, and justice-driven educators. She is the founder of Pinoy Educational Partnerships and Ethnic Studies Teaching and Research Pipeline at the director, and also the director of the Community Responsive Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Institute of Sustainable Economic, Educational, and Environmental Design. She has worked with several school districts throughout the nation, including the San Francisco Unified School District, to co-develop ethnic studies, social justice, and Filipino language curricula. Please welcome Dr. Tinchanco Cubales. Great, welcome to you both. And thanks again for joining with us. We should get started with thinking about origin stories. Everyone loves origin stories. I love origin stories. I think Iron Man 1 was, it's it, you know, Batman 1. And then, you know, Batman 22, I don't know. It's not quite the same. But the origin story, you get a sense of origins. But better than origins, which are unitary. Beginnings are multiple, and we all have different ways to account for our beginnings individually and culturally. And what I want to do is to start off this round of questioning with how we all began our relationships with Carlos. So what is your beginning story? How did you meet Carlos? Let's start with...
That's so I don't forget what I want to say. First of all, such an honor to be here. So nice to see all of you, so many greats, and such a pleasure. And I guess to dive right in, I met Carlos through another kind of local San Francisco legend, Barry McGee. And I think it was probably around 1990. And at the time, as a young, ambitious visual artist, Barry told me that he wanted me to introduce me to like one of his professors that had been an advocate for him. And so when I met him, it was only Allison, and we had a kind of a warm-up call that you brought something back. That when I first met him, I was totally unimpressed by like the way that he held his classroom.
Right, closer.
And there was a part of that, there was just a freeness and an openness. And as a kid from San Diego whose parents weren't Republican, but Catholic, traditional, there was so much about that container that didn't make sense to me, that didn't seem appropriate, that didn't seem controlled or official in the way that I thought should be appropriate. But because of my own ambition, I was like, sure, I'll come talk to your class if you want me to talk to your class. And so he actually invited me to come and speak to his class. And so that's kind of how I met him. And it wasn't really that resonant. But then a couple years later, I was invited back to speak at the Art Institute. And I gave a lecture, and the lecture was really kind of powerful. And in the middle of the lecture, we're doing questions. Carlos stands up and says, would you come here and teach? Would you be open to that? And again, this young, ambitious visual artist, I was like, sure, I'd come back here and teach. And then subsequently, there was an invitation to apply for the Demon Corn Fellowship, and I won the fellowship. And so I say that story that today I still think of him as part of the reason that I ended up at the Art Institute. Not simply because of the invitation, but I think he became an advocate. Because even before I had started my emergent career and had moved to New York, he saw someone who was aspiring as a young creative person to have a social impact. And I think that was our kinship. And then when I actually came to the Art Institute, we developed a more kind of personal relationship that really was deeper than what we had had previously, even through the luggage store and other kind of constellations. So I think I'll start with that and let you go.
I have no paper and no iPad. Good luck, everybody.
You can freestyle. I know you can freestyle. She could freestyle.
Let me not freestyle. No. First off, I just want to say how honored I am to have been invited to do this. Like, I had some discomfort, I'll be real. I'm like, why would they ask me to talk about Carlos? There's so many people that he mentored, so many people that were close to him. I went to his memorial, I was sad and I was deeply moved by the amazing stories. And I said, well, I can't say no. You know? How do I talk about him? And then I had to go back. And I realized, oh, I know why. So, just like Carlos, I didn't turn in a more recent bio because it's actually 22 years ago when I started at San Francisco State. 2000, the year 2000, Y2K. We thought it was going to end. Right? Y'all remember that feeling like, oh, you know, you start to stock up on all these things, crackers that you never eat, like Spam, cheese. I'm starting to talk like him. Okay, and I started at San Francisco State. I got this job as a professor, very confused how I got the job too, right? And Dan Gonzalez, Professor Daniel Gonzalez, was my mentor, my designated mentor from San Francisco State. And he said, you gotta get tenure. I had no idea really what that meant. From me kind of coming out of graduate school, I was like, oh, I wanna do like student services. I don't know why I'm this professor. And he was like, no, you got this job for a reason and we need you to get tenure. So I'm gonna bring you to this meeting and we're going to publish. That was the promise. Because I didn't feel necessarily insecure about my teaching, and I liked working with students, but I was insecure about publishing. And he said, let me take you to this meeting and we're gonna collaborate. This is Dan Gonzalez. And so I don't like to go to places alone. I came here alone today, which is really interesting, but I don't like to go to places alone, so I brought my friend, Dr. Dawn Buhulano Mabalon. Yeah, you might know her. And so I said, Dawn, can you drive me over to Burnell Heights? I gotta go to this meeting, and I'm like kinda not sure what's gonna happen. And she's like, okay, you know, and I told Dan, and Dan's like, perfect, Dawn can also be in this project with us, right? And then he goes, I'm gonna bring my son too. I was like, wow, this is so weird, you know, like, okay. So then we parked. There's no parking on Cortland. Y'all know that, right? So I'm like driving around, parking, already frustrated, you know, like, and then like no one answers the door. We're not using cell phones at this time, by the way, or Google or all of that, right? So we're knocking, and finally this dude who looks like my dad, dressed like my dad, but has no Filipino accent, answered the door. I mean, really, if you saw a picture of my dad, you'd be like, oh my gosh, is Carlos really? No, he's not my dad. And I was like, hi. And he's like, hey, what's up? What's up, sis? He said, like, he called us sis. And I'm like, how am I your sis? You're like so much older than me. But anyways, so I'm like looking at him and going, hi, you know? And he ushers us kind of to this kitchen-looking area. And he goes, oh, make sure you eat. Grab some food. I'm like, I don't know you, and like, okay, you know, but he's a Pinoy, right? So you kind of go, okay, I better grab some food or else, I look bad. So Dawn grabbed a bunch of food, and then we went and, sat down in this, I don't know what to call it. It looked like a cafe, kind of like an area where like a bunch of the artists would come and convene, but they all had their own little studios separate from that space. So it's like a communal space. No table, just chairs that did not match. That was already freaking me out, right? And I'm here like, okay, I'm here. I will be in this collaborative project. I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna publish, And I sit down, and Dan Gonzalez starts talking. Have you ever been in a conversation with Dan Gonzalez? I was hoping he would be here today so I can make fun. But he talks. Then Carlos starts talking. And they're talking to each other back and forth for like 2 hours. And I'm all, where's the fucking agenda, Like, there's no agenda. I'm freaking out, right? But I'm like smiling out of like, yay, I'm with my elders, like trying to really be calm. And I'm going, damn, maybe this is a get to know you meeting. right? So I kind of excused it, and I was like, okay. Oh, are they really? And they asked us a bunch of questions, and I was like, yeah, you know. And he's like, where are your family from? I'm like, why does this have to do with, what is this, you know? So I was like, okay, cool. And Don's like, ooh, that was a long meeting, right? But nothing was decided. So, okay, we're like, all right, whatever. You can't say no, right? So then he goes, okay, the next meeting is like, 2 weeks from now. It's like every couple weeks. So we come back to the next meeting. It was the same damn thing. 2 more hours of like talking, right? And they were talking about all kinds of stuff. I mean, I don't know how many times in the 70s. I was like, dang, that's when I was born, And I just kept like going, okay, right? And I'm trying to take notes, Arel Gonzalez, Dan Gonzalez's son, he was like the best note taker. So he would just like take notes. And I'm like, I wonder what he's taking notes on, So this goes on and on for a year. A year. We still don't know what we're writing, right? And he's asking us stories about, what is the most craziest experience you've ever had as a Pinay in San Francisco? I was like, I don't know, And so we were like giving him stories back, and we were talking. And then at some point, a year later, there was a table of contents. And Theo, thank God for Theo, showed up and started like kind of massaging things. Arel started massaging things. We started writing, right? And bringing these stories, these sort of abstract, he called them transgressive stories. And at that point, we wrote and wrote. And then I spoke in his classes, started to just show up, like unprepared like I am today. I was told by him not to prepare today, so I'm not prepared. I feel like at that moment, I really learned. It wasn't the agenda. It wasn't the table of contents, to be real, because we didn't publish the book, by the way. It's still sitting there. Someday, right? Someday. It was really his essence, his being, his ability to make you feel seen, make you feel heard. It was all about this pedagogy, or via pedagogy, that was really about love. I know you do love work. We all do love work, right? And that's very much rooted in the permission by our elders to be able to do this work. So I'll just start. That was a lot, but thank you.
Thank you, Allison. I think both of these stories remind me about the nature of Carlos's process. It was very iterative, which is to say it was drawn out, and it reminded me a lot of the Spanish language exam that I took as a graduate student. And Raul Fernandez at UC Irvine said, okay, now it's time for your exam. I want you to order a beer from me. So I did, and he said, well, you totally screwed that up. You just failed this exam. And he said, if we're going to do this in Latin America, if you really want to do this field work, you really want to get out and become a scholar at this, you have to understand you're going to have to be building relationships, and you can't just ask for things outright. And so while I was able to technically proficient in structuring an interrogative in Spanish, that wasn't the goal. The goal was to develop a relationship, and I took that to heart. And that's exactly, I think, what Carlos has tried to do, especially with all of his meetings where he calls you at 6 or 7 in the morning and 5 in the morning, and meet me at 5:25 for breakfast and omelets. And then you realize this is a project, and it may not go anywhere, but you're in company, and you're in community, and it's the start of something. And who knows where the end of it is. So beginnings can be everywhere. Origins, that's a different story. But what a beautiful way to begin with these various notions of Carlos. I'm sure you might have your own beginning stories with Carlos, so I'd love to be able to have you share that with us as well when we get to Q&A section. So I'd like to get to this next part of this discussion where we can talk about something that was really quite impactful for Carlos. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read this fascinating interview that was done with him in 1995, 1996 with Paul Karlstrom at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. It's a really extensive conversation that he had, and it lays out his own background and memories and the kind of arc of his life up to that point. So it's a wonderful document, and I'd urge you to check it out. But in it, he mentioned several times a concept that he would return to again and again in public, in his own work, in various convenings, in publications. And it's the concept of a street scholar. So I'd like both of you to reflect on this quote by Carlos about who the street scholar is and what it means to be engaged in street scholarship. So this is a quote from Carlos from that interview. Quote, "I think art is boundless. In its boundless state, art can provide street scholarship. It can invite opinion. It can invite many of these things that have been completely submerged in a lot of people for such a long time. And it could come out in so many different kinds of forms. It could come out in documentary form. It could come out in abstract forms. It could come out in poetic forms. Artists and cultural workers are conduits to their communities and from their communities," unquote. How could you make sense of what it means to be a street scholar with Carlos? What does that mean to you, those words? Who wants to start?
Well, I'd like to say, I mean, just to be clear, my introduction about meeting him was not about his lacking as a professor as much as it was my lacking of the possibilities of what could be in relationship. And I think the fact that he had invited me there was such an embodiment of him being a street scholar, and the fact that literally, I was doing work on the street, and he was literate enough not only about the culture but the kind of the signs and symbols to recognize me and find me and have me come in, and in that way really be a conduit to expanding what the Art Institute was actually sharing as knowledge and redefining those boundaries, which in the time. That's why I was saying my own young ambition, like I was too myopic in my purpose to recognize what was happening around me. That he was actually scaffolding me at the same time transforming the institution by having me be there. And so for me, like when I think of that term, just as a street scholar, and particularly as it relates to him, it's just that kind of balanced notion of where the kind of end of the canon exists. I've been working with, I'm working with this right now at year one. I'm working with Liz Lerman, this great choreographer. And if you indulge me, she tells me this great story. Like she was trained as a dancer. And she was taught all the time to go like this as part of the canon of dance. And so for so much of her life, that was her training. And then invariably, she started to realize there were limitations to the canon and wanted to expand beyond it in so many ways. But she found that so oftentimes when things get hard, she goes to this. And it's such a great metaphor when I think of institutions, like institutions trying to do new things or new community engagements, but when it starts to be charging or like challenging, then they go back to that form. And I think part of Carlos's radicality was the way that he was always transforming that form, both in his person, in his practice, in his social relations, and so that's the piece that for me, and I'll end with this to give to you, I mean, for me, part of the power of this panel is trying to bring that broader kind of capacity to his person and his work that's not just in the objecthood. Part of the convention of the Asian Art Museum is we're going to show you objects and stuff, and this is supposed to be Carlos, when really the street scholar is so much broader than objecthood. And I think part of the passion that's brought us all here and that we share with him is because of that other kind of personhood that transcends objecthood.
I like listening to you.
What'd you say?
I like listening to you, dude.
Well, after you just
We
opened,
gotta-
I was
we
like, I
gotta,
gotta do something.
We got to collab. That's how it goes, right? You put up people on panel, like, oh, yeah, let's do this thing, I came to Carlos 2000 as a ball of insecurities. Like, because I was not a typical scholar. I actually wasn't a great student to begin with. Like, I didn't go to a four-year university right away. I struggled. I didn't come from a family with a lot of money, like some of my, colleagues did, right? Like, I'm not pointing at the two of you. I just was doing that thing. That was weird. That was weird. But I feel like I came into academia as an accident, and so coming into that space, being promised to publish, I was looking for like that kind of strange guidance or recognition, and what I got was so much more. I came in with a lot of imposter feelings, like imposter, I'm not really a scholar, I'm not really an artist, I'm not, all these things, and finding that what I was really learning in that space was how to be a really good person, how to really be able to see people, be able to create relationships with people. So when I think of street scholar, it's like really, I felt like he was training us to be street scholars when street is not necessarily studying the other, right? Like really studying ourselves and our relationship to our communities, our relationship to people. And when I think of street, I mean like quite literally, I feel like he had us go outside of what we understood as the confines of academia, and to me, that street is everywhere. That's our whole community. And I appreciate him so much for that because I was not validated in academia. But in that space, when I would go over to Cortland, I felt like, oh, okay, I felt like I got to eat there. I got to listen to conversations, right? I wasn't insecure about what was coming out of my mouth, if I was saying it the right way. Like all of those things kind of embodied like how I understood his not just being a street scholar, but then also allowing space for us to learn how to be street scholars.
No, absolutely right. What Carlos, I think, demonstrates is a critique of the academy. The structural limitations of what it knows, because it purports to produce knowledge. And when your teacher tells you there is no Filipino art history, it's not because there's no Filipino art history, it's because that particular scholar doesn't know anything about art history. It's because your archive or your library doesn't have the requisite materials in that institution. It's because they don't have the requisite librarians and staff and archivists and others. There was Filipino art history, but it had to be discovered outside of the academy. And that's what Carlos knew. I think that's what Carlos knew. I think when we study his biography, we realize that when he comes back to San Francisco in 1969, he's in the middle of the Tenderloin and he's teaching young people. He's looking at African American and Latino kids. He's inspired by Rascuache. He wonders, there is art and purpose and meaning in ironing a t-shirt. Ironing a t-shirt as crisp as white, crisp as a diamond, and he sees that as something that's valuable, that's missing in the academy. So was there no Filipino art history? Oh, thank goodness he was so hard-headed. That is a tradition in Filipino culture. Tigas ng ulo, tigas ng ulo. It means hard-headed. Can you imagine being a student and listening to that instructor? Thank goodness he didn't listen to that instructor and say, I'm gonna go study a better funded art history discipline. And then what? Replicate how the academy actually funds and rewards certain communities. Thank goodness he didn't have that. He was hard-headed. The problem with being hard-headed, though, is you run into a life of hard-headed resources and hard-headed people and being out on the street. Street scholarship, it was a way of generating knowledge outside of the confines of the discipline. And thank goodness he was here in San Francisco to take those cues. He was learning from Rupert Garcia and Amali Mesa Baines about what was happening in Latino history, how to challenge literacy by putting murals out into the streets on Capitol buildings and the rest. That's what he took inspiration from. So when we think about Carlos and his journey, it ultimately becomes cross-racial, cross-cultural. It becomes something that's outside of the institution itself. And so street scholarship, my goodness, it's proper that we open with Alleluia Panis and ritual, because embedded in those movements are are generations of knowledge that deserves to be in a place like this every day. So street scholars, oh, hey, thank you. Remember, you get what you pay for. So thank you, Carlos, for sharing those words. Street scholarship becomes embedded in a lot of our practices. And that's what I want to hear from you next is, how are some of these methods, how does this work in some of your own, projects when we think about street scholarship? Sometimes we are translating some of these concepts into our own lives and projects. Allison, I wanted to ask you about the art book, the art in the PDF that you sent, about the hip hop choreography that.
It was a secret.
Oh, well, it was.
I'm just kidding. No, it's okay. I'll talk about
secret.
it.
Okay.
I'm just teasing.
This is why we prepare, isn't it? This is why I come to rehearsal. Let me ask you about that, because you're involved in a lot of interesting pedagogical projects that think about what hip hop can bring to knowledge, how knowledge can be produced in embodied practices like hip hop, because it seems to echo what Carlos had been doing, like, for example, in 1980 at the farm in Ritual, where he's using his own body and embodying practice across cultures. What does that mean for you when you're thinking about this project with Patrick Cruz?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to share this with you all, because this is a project I really have not put out there yet, and I've been working on it for over a year and a half. Some of you might know some of my work with Pinay and Pinoy Educational Partnerships, or PEP. I just recently retired as the executive director, which is very good, transitioning, moving on. There's such great people who are going to be running that space. But this last year, I've been working with this hip-hop group called The Company. You might know them. Some people know them connected to the Kinjas. So one of the Kinjas, we are familiar, maybe a little bit. You know those dance shows on TV, World of Dance. Okay. America's Best Dance Crew. Well, so there's one person, his name is Pat Cruz, who happens to be my daughter's hip-hop teacher. And we had a conversation. I was approached by a funder to do a project. They're like, why don't you do an art project? I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And then they mentioned that they wanted to bring on Pat Cruz as someone to do a project. What ended up happening was I had some really good meetings with Pat Cruz, and now I think about it, those meetings sounded like some of the meetings I had with Carlos. We just talk and talk and talk, and then somehow landed on an idea called art of work, like work of art, but art of work. And so I'm currently providing support for 8 hip-hop dancers, choreographers, who are amazing, world-renowned, and providing them ethnic studies. Many of them did not get to go to college and experience ethnic studies, and so I'm providing them ethnic studies content, Filipinx American studies, along with labor studies, really understanding our experiences with labor in the United States, and also bringing in elements of somatic healing. And they are currently, we're in our last few sessions this summer, and then they will choreograph a joint piece that then will be filmed and then shown publicly in probably a year from now. But it has been amazing. And when I think of Carlos's influence, and I guess I'm making the connections in front of you all right now, like a lot of what he taught was about developing relationships and really centering reflection, right? Like really just deep reflection. And that's what I've been doing with this group, which has really become part of my pedagogy in general, and the work that I do with students. And I feel like a lot of it is rooted in those early conversations that I had with Carlos, that I had with Al Robles, that I had with Bill Soro, that I had with Dan Gonzalez, all of which are these Pinoys who mentored me. Maybe they weren't formally my mentors, but they mentored me to really be able to have this kind of pedagogy. So, thanks, Carlos. I'm looking at his picture right here. He's staring at me.
He's right above us.
Yeah.
Brett, I want to carry on something that Allison just mentioned concerning this notion of healing. I know it seems to be something that's central in your practice as well. Could you talk about how healing figures prominently in your own work?
Well, I think a good way to start to talk about healing, I often use a quote from Andrew Weil. He's kind of like a popular, he's actually has a history as a researcher, but he's kind of more known for restaurants and spontaneous healing and kind of a popular guru. But he talks about healing. When he says healing, treatment comes from without, healing comes from within. Healing's really talking about regaining integrity and balance. And so I think that's such a good framework and understanding to kind of think from, that I think so oftentimes in my training formally, even if it was like a social agenda, you're trying to treat something. Like, I'm going to go to this other place and help these people or transform this thing. That's not really about it coming from within. It's really from it coming from without. And so I think, for me, part of what's resonating now is thinking about how, part of healing from within is being in relationship and having that not be something you're doing to someone else, but realizing this is something I'm doing with and for myself. And so kind of bring it back to the initial prompt. Right now I'm working at Yerba Buena, and I think, Yerba Buena is such an interesting place because it's right around the time that I was starting to be around Carlos, but not only Carlos, like a vibrant time in the kind of creative history of the Bay Area. But when I think of its story, it's never really lived up to everyone's expectations. It's a place that, I was one of the first people that painted the wall around it when they were building it with Barry and Michael Rios. And, some people thought it was going to be like a Kunsthalle, and they had drains in the galleries, and they had this board that had people from, the 6th Street Photography Workshop. It was going to be community connected. And other people on Bush Street, they're going to have, real art there, stuff that's at, fairs. And it's never really, for any of those places, kind of held itself well. And so it's always kind of, even young artists are like, you're supposed to blow me up. You don't have any permanent collection. You don't have any collector base or real relationships. And even further back, the Filipino community that used to be there was part of how that even exists. That you may or may not know, I assume many of you do, that, it was really in the redevelopment that community organized and said, this is not right. We don't want this. And the city threw the art center in almost as a bone. So it's been interesting for me to be there, that really part of my work there initially was, okay, we know you do things in community, and we know you do things about healing, and maybe there's some way in the traditional way we'll have you come in and you can treat what's around us to make us look like we're actually in better relation. And I don't think that's what they said, but that's what so oftentimes is my prompt. And because of a lot of conditions, including the pandemic and other things, it really changed to where I've really been trying to transform them. And that's meant that unlike even other people on the staff, I'm meeting with leadership, I'm going to board meetings, I'm all these stratas of the institution as an advocate to be you should be in relation. Rather than the conventions of how institutions work, whether it's we have a programming schedule, we're going to do this for 3 months and then change and never talk to those people again, or whether it's just thinking about how are these things transactional, what can it be that somehow you're going to benefit me in the end? What would it be, in the spirit of Carlos, to really just be there as a listener and really be an advocate and recognize the codependency or the interconnectedness of your relationship and transform that? And for them, part of that has been be in partnership with Somos Filipinas, be in partnership with even just that community around you for no finite amount of time, just ongoing, as a way to start to transform your own way of being. And so I guess I'll wrap up in saying that, I think that's another thing that I really wanted to share, as I think we're here because of this exhibition, and so much of the time we think of art as, again, objects or products that are about the point of what we're really trying to focus on. And I guess I would argue that I think part of his greatness and part of what resonates for me is this understanding that it's really a multiplicity of kind of impacts that transcends not just objecthood, but I would say even disciplines and ways of being. And providing food, or being an advocate, or addressing imposter syndrome, or being related to other kind of cultural streams that aren't part of the canon, that's all part of healing. I think another part of treatment when we're oppressed or we're not healthy, we think that actually it's about reversing oppression. So when I was younger, it was like, okay, well, they're not actually treating this community well. The really healthy way to do this would be to invert oppression and punish them, get them back. Somehow, like that would make things more whole. But it actually makes things more conflicted. And so I guess what I'm saying, and it's a kind of an abridged version of what's happening in Yerba Buena, but like encourage them, like Carlos, to think of an array of values, an array of possibilities, an array of cultures, not as things that are transactional, but as resources. And when I think of you mentioned this, that from the 60s or whatever, just having that kind of understanding that isn't this traditional hierarchical from power, but more about a relationship that's about collective kind of learning.
It's so important, Brett, because I think what Carlos helps to demonstrate is the difficulty of not only having to learn something, but the necessity to unlearn what we have come to know. So it's not as if he just simply had to play with some feathers and get blood from Chinatown and start smearing it onto a canvas. What does it mean to unlearn the disciplines because our bodies have been so disciplined? There's muscle memory that's attached to when we come out of these institutions. And the muscle memory is intentional because our own common sense doesn't make any sense, not when we come into these institutions. Our own common sense is really anathema to what an institution needs. And that's why they need to tear us down to build us back up, and we have to have another set of muscle memories in order to respond and be rewarded by the institutions. So then, can we just add a Filipino lesson on top of the muscle memory that we have? And I think Carlos has always said, no, you have to engage in rituals which will help us unlearn what we know. And then it's not just about cooking for others. It's not just about sharing music with others. It's not just about painting for others. It is also about engaging in forms of ritual that respond to a different set of disciplines other than the clock of the capitalist, the paycheck at the end of the month. We're disciplined easily in all of our various notions to respond to those muscle memories. But imagine what it means to have to respond to a 5 a.m. phone call to him. That's a retasking of our reward structure, because now I'm realizing the most important people in my life aren't going to be my dissertation committee chairs or my bosses. They're going to be people like Carlos. And my body can respond differently to the world because now there is another person that I can take inspiration from. And it's not going to necessarily be a paycheck, is it? So the rituals that he got us into, the rituals of coffee and omelets and of meetings and all of these other questions of Allison and Dawn, please talk about transgressive Filipinos. I mean, that is a way to unlearn how our disciplines have tried to shape us. So again, thank you to Carlos for this notion of ritual and ritual making, because it is so much more than simply an add-on to the world. It's not merely a turn to the primitive, is it? It's really trying to rediscipline our lives so we respond to things that are the most valuable. We know what time it is. We know what time it is, and our rituals tell us what time it is. And we don't have to look at the capitalist's clock or the paycheck in our bank. We know what time it is, and he has helped us to set that time. So I think in all of our disciplines, we have to look to people who do that. Look to people who help us unlearn the muscle memory that we've been accustomed to. And I'm wondering then about your own experiences with mentoring others. What does it mean to now become a mentor after having been in the presence of someone like Carlos, who's demonstrated his own interesting way of being in your life, in all of our lives, of being a mentor? It's not a standard playbook of how to do this, but how do you go about mentoring others that you come into contact with? Brett, we'll start with you.
Well, I was listening to you phrase the question, and it just made me think of, I find that I'm surrounded by a lot of the people that work with me or for me don't have formal education in terms of art school, or their undergraduate degree may be in ethnic studies, or they don't have a master's in artistic practice. And in some ways, I think that's helped them be more open to the possibilities of what could be. That they've been less calcified by that thing that you're talking about, that Carlos has been such a catalyst for us to transform in ourselves. And so I think for me, part of that role is to cultivate that freedom in them, to have that, to not feel the limits of the expert's mind, but to have the beginner's mind and just believe that anything can be possible. And I think that's such a traditional tension when we talk about these traditional artistic spaces that are built on specific ways of being, specific ways of knowledge, specific ways of interacting. And so I think, that there's that part of hopefully trying to empower people. And then the other thing that we had talked on a preliminary call that I think Carlos embodied was this idea of service, and his sense of love, and that, when I think about, on the one hand, you think of his history, and he's on this trajectory to be this famous minimalist or kind of commercial artist, and then leaves that trajectory to no longer be this icon of art form, and yet in this local ecology, he's like a pillar. He's a giant that transcends just the Panoy. I mean, he's Dewey Crumpler, he's Amalia Mesa Bay. Like, there are all these other cultural kind of like cornerstones that work together to actually form this ecology. That in a way is another type of mentorship. It's another model for the people that are following to see what is possible, what could be. And so I think there's another part of that when I think about our kinship, and part of what I find inspirational about him is that kind of trajectory of realizing that actually that traditional, formal, famous artist practice is not necessarily a relational practice in the spirit of community, or maybe limited in what impacts could be possible to make someone feel like they could publish. That there are other ways, not better or worse, but just a wider spectrum of ways that you can have impact that I think I find kind of a certain kinship in when I think of his story.
I always have food. I think it's a ditto, and then I always have food. Like, students come to my office, I'm like, you look hungry. If I don't have it there, we're gonna go to, bookstore and get you some snacks. That really was all snacks, by the way. It wasn't like a full charcuterie that Carlos would put out. It was a lot of snacks. But there was always food. I always ask a lot of questions of my students, my poor students. I'm always like, what's your purpose, right? I think that really comes from Carlos. These things are really about the development of relationships, right? But I will also say, and Mark, I don't know if you remember when we brought bell hooks to San Francisco State. I think that do you where's Mark? Over there, sorry. I knew it was like this direction. Mark, do you remember when we brought bell hooks to San Francisco State? And it was an honor, to have bell hooks, and we lost bell hooks this year, right? And I was honored to be able to do like a spoken word piece. I was like a young faculty member doing spoken word with my students. And I said to bell hooks, like in passing, hey, I'm creating this thing called Pinaism. And I was explaining it to her, and she goes, you go do that. That's all she had to say. You go do that. And it just galvanized me in all these directions in the work that I was trying to do and doing. Carlos, very similar. I had this idea of doing PEP, right? This is the year before. I met him the year before I started PEP. And I said, I feel like, we don't have Filipino American studies in schools. Students are always talking about they don't know their identity, blah, 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 blah. And I got, all these students at SF State. What do you think about bringing them to this thing, to do this work, like at a high school or something? And he was like, he said something very similar to bell hooks. You should do that. That's, for me, the kind of mentorship I hope that I can, or the mentor that I can be for people. Just, you can do it. I know that sounds like, sometimes it sounds a little strange to tell people that, but I'm like, yeah, that's a great idea. You should do that. And it's not an issue of being necessarily the person to validate someone's dream, but not to be the person who says you shouldn't. And so, to me, that's the kind of mentor I hope to continue to be, and have food, ask a lot of questions, and tell people that they can actually do what they want to do.
No, that's empowering someone. That's definitely how to empower young folks in our classes, when we make these connections. Let's switch to another topic that concerns word time, Filipino word time. How about we think about a word that Carlos uses? It's in the exhibition. It's called Utang, and it's a deep word, folks. So if you're not familiar with this concept, we're going to get to the heart of it. But let's hear a quote from Carlos, and here it goes. Utang is the Filipino word for tribute, or what you owe. Utang, U-T-A-N-G. The way my parents used the term, particularly when a member of the family died, took on a ceremonial aura. When it was used otherwise, there was a tone to it that carried an urgency, not to be taken lightly. Utang, U-T-A-N-G. That's your Filipino word for the day. I hope you can take it with you, and maybe you could use it in a sentence as you walk about town today. Use it properly, not tongue. Okay, but yeah, no, not the curse words. U-T-A-N-G, Utang. Everyone always learns the curse words first. I mean, that's just kind of universal. But Utang. So when we think about this, what does that? How can we think about that notion of a debt, what you owe, and what is that? How can this mean something in our own practice, either as artists or educators or people connected to communities? Allison, you want to start?
Sure. Sorry, I'm like laughing about utang. So utang na loob, like a debt that you owe from within, is also problematic. Like, so I just want to be careful about how I present this idea of utang. Like, you owe somebody something, like to the point where like you diminish your agency, your ability, yourself. So I don't think that that's what, when Carlos used the word utang, I don't think that that's what he meant. I think what he meant was you owe it to yourself, you owe it to people to really become. That's kind of how I understand utang. Like, and then that don't think, I mean, I don't know, he wasn't really one of those people who was like checking us. He wasn't, I don't know what he would feel about cancel culture and all that stuff right now, but I feel like Carlos would say something like, utang is about another word called atang. So atang, with an A instead of a U, in Ilocano, and my friend has been writing about this concept, atang. Arlene Daus Magbuwal is writing about atang. She described atang as creating an altar, and the things that you bring that to honor. And so utang, if it is conceptually attached to atang, it is things that we do to honor, not necessarily debt, like in the capitalist sense of debt, yeah? So I think of the concept of atang, and I think, gosh, what are the things in which I would put on my altar to really honor, Carlos? We probably all have different ideas of what that would be. And for some reason, when you were talking about like those different items and the different things, and that, like when we begin to look at what we see, it's not just the product, right? But I would imagine that there are things that we would see in this display that we would also add to our atang, like learning about how he used certain things, how he brought in the stories of our people throughout, and how he mixed them with indigeneity in ways that we're just discovering now. For some of us, right? I just feel like there's so much when I think about the concept of utang and atang that really helps me understand that there's so much that I would love to honor him with. I think on my altar there would be some crackers, there would be some coffee, right? And then there would be lots of words. And they're not published, but lots of words.
Well, I kind of read it to understand more of that idea again of service. That's kind of how it resonates for me. And this idea that, to kind of be more articulate, what I think I was stumbling through before is, for so much of my training in Western art, the individual, my craft was the thing that was going to make me great. It's the individual master that makes these incredible objects or things, and that's part of usually the validation. And it's not to diminish, I think that, there are a lot of creative people in the room. We know that there is transcendent transformation and power that comes in the process of making things. And I just think there's also another kind of thing when I think of Carlos, it's like a service that's not about me as an individual. It's not, I don't want to or need to claim it. It's actually in the service of something both part of me and beyond me. In a success that, it's such a cliche for us as teachers. Like there's so many things that we share in our learning journey that we're not going to see the benefits of from our students. That's going to manifest and grow long after we're in touch with them for whatever the conditions are. And so I kind of think of it more in that way, that kind of mindset that I think, and I'm trying to juxtapose it not as a critique of these conditions of the canon or of museums, but just it's such a different perspective to think of the difference between an individual sensibility and a communal sensibility. And think of so much of when we talk about building relationships, that's coming from a whole other kind of cultural and personal sensibility around being in relation beyond you.
Yeah, I think you both are absolutely right. You're hitting on something that I think Carlos understood well, which was that the debt was, well, in terms of Filipino culture, it's an unpayable debt, right? So the full phrase is utang na loob meaning inside, not just physically inside a person's body, but the deepest part of oneself. And oftentimes, utang na loob is the unpayable debt to a mother, as if to say, from the mother to the child, oh, there's no way you can pay me back. There's zero chance you can pay me back. I know it's my birthday, but whatever gift you give me, believe me, you cannot pay me back. But it can be punitive in the way that Allison's talking about, right? Where you hold over something and it becomes something of a burden. It's like, oh, you got to do this. That's your utang. You got to do this for your uncles. You got to do this for aunties. You got to do this for the people. You got to do this for the revolution. And at that point, it becomes kind of a burden where you don't want to serve that debt. This kind of debt, I think that Carlos has been talking about, is how to pay things forward. And I think the best teachers, and the two of you embody that, represents what that means, which is to pay something forward mightily, which is to not know who is going to be the beneficiary. It is to not know who will get it. It's to not know who's going to be the Carlos in your classroom, who's going to be the hard-headed one, because we have to approach all of the folks in the classroom equally, and hopefully you get a hard-headed one like him in your classrooms. But that kind of utang is fascinating to me to think about, because he has used it and referred to it in his own works for so many years. And for many of us, it becomes this kind of complicated concept in Filipino culture. How can we resist the punitive nature of our own? He's mentioned this also in his earlier works. He's talked about how Filipino communities in the United States, specifically in San Francisco, applied so much self-loathing to themselves. There was a sense that they hated themselves. You'll see this in the pages of America's in the Heart, where they are backbiting, they are hating each other. They're taking advantage of one another when they land here in the United States. That vile behavior, just to stay ahead of the depression, just to stay ahead of the misery of this place. Self-loathing is something that Carlos refers to, and even though he might say that it is deep in Filipino culture, something that should be revised, something that should be excised from our own cultural vocabulary. But Utang, what a fascinating way to think about our own sense of debt as we try to pay things forward. You folks have been really great so far. How are we doing? Oh, no, well. How about this? How about we take some questions and comments from a hungry audience? And we'll start with Dr. Goldberg. Dr. David Goldberg, who's with us from the Disney Corporation. Thank you.
Thank you. Great panel. When I came over with Carlos, one of the magical things about working with him was that he made it seem like nothing was urgent. Things were important, but that 5 a.m. meeting, like there was urgency that you had to get there by 5, and he always had a parking place in front of wherever he was meeting you somehow.
So there was parking.
Not in front of his studio, but when Carlos had you go
nothing
to
at Lee
meet
Street.
somewhere in the Mission or wherever,
Yeah.
he always had Rockstar parking. I don't know how he did it. Yeah, that was one of his spots, definitely. But things really feel more urgent now. And I also don't want to think that's an illusion, because part of some of what you guys are saying about the ritual of time and getting away from the clock and the paycheck has to do with, the climate is warming and San Francisco is less gray than it's ever been. It's all super harsh binaries in this city now. And I don't want to mistake the sharpness of it for unnecessary urgency, because I think we do have time and we don't have time. We have plenty of time, there's no time, there's time enough, there's never enough time. And I was wondering if you folks could speak to how, as you look at the students and the people you're working with now, how you negotiate this idea of the urgency, because there are some things that are running out. But at the same time, there is room to maneuver. So if you guys could speak a little bit to how you feel around urgency and mentorship and time and motion.
I love this question, David. Thank you for asking this. Yeah. Who wants to start?
Well, I don't know. Some of this I'm going to freestyle. But at the end of this last thing, I was left thinking about the ways that I thought Carlos used ritual in a way almost to play with time. Kind of the way that ritual is often used and the way that you're phrasing the question. And it just made me think that increasingly, to your question, I think so much more longitudinally about impacts. Kind of like we were actually just talking about a minute ago. Like, it wasn't that long ago that's like, oh, I'm just trying to grind and teach for the next 6 months and find a way to pay my rent for right now. And then when that gig's done, I'll have my next consulting gig. And that's such a common trope. Whereas I think now I'm much more kind of considered about, just like I said to you, it's chess, not checkers. And like the long-term impacts take longer to make, take longer to bake, take longer to change. So it is kind of a koan, a little bit, a kind of an oxymoron, because on the one hand, I completely agree with you. It's desperate times. And in some ways, the way that we need to build healthy relationships can only take time. The way that you can actually build constituencies and solidarity and shared values and shared language, like that takes time to make together. And so in some ways for me, that almost seems like part of the battle, is reframing the way we all look at kind of timelines that way. Because I think so oftentimes in the chaos of this moment, that becomes the legitimization to not actually be in right relation. That becomes the alibi. Like we don't have the time to actually do this right. We just need to make it look right. And so for me, it's almost made me double down on I'm not doing this through Zoom conversations. We're not gonna do this project that way. Because this isn't just about right now. This is about a longer time. And helping, and I'll end with, I think that's one of the things I'm reflecting on, just, wondering about how clairvoyant he was about understanding his impact over time. That he's not, it still strikes me like you have people here that are passionate about him that have never met him. And they're his champions. And so for me, it makes me think still about, in the midst of this kind of catastrophe, still this other, primordial time, agricultural time, these other times that really are the foundations of our existence, not industrial time, corporate time.
I haven't thought about time. Thank you for that question. Just context, I came out of a 3-day retreat centered around healing and AccuBreath, and so I may seem calmer than I usually am, partly because of that and needing to do that. I am a responsive person. I would think I'm responsive. If there's an issue, I'm right on top of it. Yesterday, 2 days ago, a friend of mine got beaten at the Warrior celebration by a police officer, immediately on top of it with a lawyer. You know, like those, when I think of the immediate urgency, those things, we're fighting for Filipino language, San Francisco Unified, right on top of it. You know, like there are things that require us to be urgent in terms of time and action, but those things only work if you're in right relationship with yourself and with people. Because things that become urgent, if you don't have those relationships in place, you're scrambling. Whereas if you have these kinds of I'm not speaking as Carlos, I'm speaking as myself, you know, and my ideas. Like if we are constantly in relationship with each other and in a certain kind of love and trust, then during those urgent times, it just takes a text or a phone call, right? And people show up. I think, though, the part that I would like to focus on is really the time it takes to be with people, get to know them, see them, love them, that Carlos was so good at. So when he would call, we were there. It wasn't Utang in the, like, I owe you because you're my elder. It was Utang because, man, you hella listened to me that one time, so I better come and show up that day. Or like, yeah, you fed me when I was hungry, so I'm gonna show up that day, you know? Like, and so for me, when I think of time, I think we really should consider what we decide to spend our time doing. There's always something that's urgent. And I think that it's important to consider that you choose also what you want to act upon and what you have the capacity to do. Sometimes people ask me this question, like, well, how do you do all the stuff you do? You know, I love that question. I'm like, oh, you're really a mom? Like, why do I not look like a mom? You're a professor? You don't look like... So I sometimes, I used to internalize those things, but now my answer back, and my answer has been, like, when people ask me how I do what I do, I just tell them I don't do it alone. I don't do things alone. Everything is in a collective fashion, you know? Like, and now when I publish, I'm like, okay, which 5 of you wants to be on this article? You know, like, and I'll just be the last author, especially now in our time where we're like, we don't have to worry about that. Like, you know, just making sure we bring people along with us. To me, that's the time that's how I want to be using my time.
Yeah, it's a great question, David, this notion of urgency, how to respond to the urgency, because there are forces in this country that very much have a definitive idea about what it means to be an American, and some of that is part of the old traditions of America, which are very deep, which is one way to resolve this notion about what it means to be an American is exclusion. It's time to build walls, it's time to put people out, and whether it's 1882, 1924, 1934, all of those exclusion acts against Asian Americans. Those are very deep traditions. So this country knows what to do with people of Asian descent when they don't want them in this country anymore. And they have very definitive traditions as to how to go about it. But the urgency, how do we deal with that? I mean, I think about Carlos's affect and his demeanor. He always seemed to be someone, you're absolutely right. You'd get a call from him, but it wasn't like a fire alarm. It was something that was something else. It's part of the work. I'm responding to this other long-term work that has already been there. And the question is, how am I going to choose to respond to that? How am I going to choose to participate in that? And I always thought about Carlos the same way that I think about how Allison mentioned other people like Al Robles, who's been another a wonderful figure to think about. These are people who were participating in traditions that outlived the headlines. They outlived the day-to-day because they were there for others. Because they knew to care for seniors, to care for children, you couldn't respond to the day-to-day. You had to respond to the life. And I remember Al Robles would deal with young people, and he'd say, all right, you young hip-hoppers, you young whippersnappers, calm down a little bit. Give me a poem, and I'll cook you some rice. What does that have to do with the day-to-day? And he's teaching people to calm down because it takes about 20 minutes to make rice. So at least for 20 minutes, they're going to have to calm down a little bit and think about a poem. How we can train ourselves to think about what is urgent. For me, I think if we're lucky enough to have people like Carlos and Al and others in our lives, we know what is urgent. And we respond to that. Something else that Brett said that I thought was really fascinating, I love the fact that there are so many people who have never met Carlos and are inspired by him. And I love that. It shouldn't be a shock to us, but I think I'm inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. I've never met the man, and that's exactly how it should be. We should be inspired by people like Larry Itliong. I've never met the man, but my life is incomplete without my understanding of these people. If you haven't met Haunani K. Trask in Hawaii, we lost her recently. I met her, I knew her. She was a good friend. But that doesn't mean you can't be as inspired as I am by her presence and her life. That's how it should be. And again, our institutions love to remind us who we should be thinking about and caring about. We know what time it is. We know who our people should be in our lives. And thank you again to Tricia and Mark for reminding us of this, and Abby Chen for putting this together, for thinking about these are the people that we should be responding to, just as we should all these other folks who we will never get a chance to know in real life in person. So I love the fact that people are inspired by it, but that's exactly how it should work, because it is if he is here today, that spirit, that presence continues to inspire us. And it's just as urgent, you see what I'm saying? It's, in that sense, it's just as alive and a fire being lit within us. Who else has a question or a comment?
Hello, thank you all. I fall into that category of not knowing Carlos. And I was born and raised in San Francisco. Okay? So, I'm just going to cut to the chase. My name is Francis. In closing this out or following through the rest of the day, in the spirit of Carlos, how do we embody the moment? How do we step into the time, the ritual, the Utang, the Atang that he presented to us? How do we carry that through at least today? What would that look like?
That's great. Yeah, how do we embody that? How do we embody Carlos's charge for today? Who wants it? Alison.
Hi.
Thank you, Francis.
I would simply say meet someone new. I mean, there's a way to look at the work. I think that, we can provide certain lenses and stuff, but maybe today meet someone new and have an actual conversation with somebody in the space. I think he would love that.
Yeah, I try not to be a person who tells people what they should or should not do. And I will say that I'm still really thinking about your question, David, in the sense that I think there's something about presence that I so oftentimes feel when I'm rushed or when things seem urgent. I'm actually not very present or able to be very skillful with my actions. And I think part of the effect when I think about Carlos is like, to all of our points, like there was so seldom that I can recall that sense of rush, that he wasn't present or we weren't present. I have another friend, a teacher I've taught around about Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks a lot about, actually one of the most precious things we have to offer is our time. He tells the famous story. He tells the story about, the businessman who's very successful and a corporate leader and all these things, but is never with their family. And the most precious thing that he could have is not all the wealth, not all the objects, but just time with his kids. So I guess in the same way, like, it makes me really think about the preciousness of all of these people coming together today. Not just because of the legacy that it historicizes about this artist and his work, but a testament to the relationships that exist here in this ecosystem. And to the people here that have put this together and that have been inspired by him. And using this kind of, I think for me, part of my acceptance, because like you, I was like, why would they have me do this? Is really out of respect and honor to all of you, to all of us who know each other and know him, and really celebrate that, I think is what I want to try to do.
Thank you again, Francis. I think one way to consider this is to, for all of us, understand the difference between a degree and an education. And again, like the best teachers, Carlos was one of the best teachers. And certainly we have two great teachers here as well. Carlos understood this, I think. And the idea between a degree and an education, a degree is what they have to give you because you paid for the units. Right? You've passed it, and now they should give you the credential. It's what they give you, a degree. You give yourself the education, and that doesn't stop with the diploma. And with someone like Carlos, you can just imagine working with the GI Bill. He was a veteran. There's so many ways he continued to teach himself again and again and again to be responsive to Latinos, indigenous peoples around the world about Filipino culture. He was open to the world and open to so many streams and ways of thinking. And to issue a challenge like worlds in collision, it was kind of a provocative way to think about that time in life when actual revolutions were taking place. People were suing for their own notions of sovereignty around the world, Africa, Americas, and Asia. It was really quite a violent time. And he's talking about art convenings called Worlds in Collision. But I think he was meeting that time in a way that allowed us to think of an education, how we give ourselves the best. We give ourselves the best wherever we can. So I think he would be tickled pink to see all of us and all of you here as well. We're here for each other's education because it never stops. It never stops. How about a last comment? Yes. And we'll be wrapping up soon for cake and ice cream and
Hi.
the rest.
I guess I met Carlos in the early 90s, but I would never call him an academic. I would consider him an educator in a holistic way, in a kind of meta way. And from the conversations that we're all having here, I do see that education is this bigger umbrella. And I am an educator. I met Carlos then, and there was an intervening period of time that we never really connected. So I'm back here to look at his legacy. And I do see that so many people were inspired by him. So I see parallels in my trajectory because I'm also an educator, but I'm an educator in a different field. And when I look at what I see in my students, I see possibility. And I think it is the role of the mentor and the educator to glean that, because we only have them for 15 weeks. You know, so we plant the seeds, and as you said, Brett, you never know the impact of what that seed is going to bring forth, because you will die. We will all, they will outlive me. And my one thing that I tell my students is that, you know, every year I get older, look at my hair, but every year my students are 20 years old. So the chasm of those years between us, and every semester when I face those group of students in front of them, I look at them and they look at me and they say, she could be my grandmother. But I have to disprove that because I have to make sure that I am relevant to them. And even if the years between us have widened, the longevity of what I teach and the relevance of what I teach is what I can leave with them. So, thank you for
Thank you so much
being
for that.
here.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to end our session, and your students are lucky to have you as an educator. Let's thank our two panelists, Dr. Alison Tinchaka-Cabales and Brett Cook. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the day.
The plan during the lunch hour break was to have more of an informal talk story, which proved a little difficult because there was nobody here. But there have been a few people who have wanted to share a couple of quick remembrances of Carlos before the next panel officially begins. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do that. So if you have a brief memory of an experience with Carlos or a bit of knowledge you got from him, we would love for you to share it up here, or I can wander over to you, Phil Donahue style, with the microphone. But what I would like to do is start by bringing up my fellow triplets in the mail order brides for a hot second, because Carlos brought the three of us together, and then we'll hand it off to y'all. This is Rihanna Estrada, mail order bride. This is Eliza Barrios, mail order bride. I'm Jennifer Wofford, mail order bride. We, the three of us, have a project in the Lee Gallery downstairs that was curated by Tricia Lagasso Goldberg, Abby Chen, Megan Merritt, Mark Johnson. Anyway, but we're always here. We're all together because of Carlos.
You're taller than I am, but it's okay. I will manage. Hi, everybody. Rihanna Estrada. So when I first moved to the Bay Area after graduating from college, back when I was still fresh and there was lots of collagen still, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. I wanted to be an artist, and I started calling around, trying to find opportunities to volunteer. And I found my way to, I think it was 16th Street, to the Filipino-American Arts Exposition, where Luz De Leon and Carlos Villa were organizing this exposition that was going to be at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. So I volunteered for that. I did, the things that interns might do, some administrative stuff, get packets together. So good at packets. But over the course of that time, I got to spend some time with Carlos, and he was working on an installation for Yerba Buena. And at one point, he came up to me, completely unprompted, and he said, "You're an artist, right?" And I was like, I guess I am trying to be. Being new to the area, not knowing anybody, I felt like I was still very much becoming or in the process of turning into that. And so I answered him, and then he said, "Well, so I have this project, kind of very, typically low-key Carlos. So I have this project, and I might be able to use your help if you're willing. I need to have, I want to make this like a quilt of dreams that's going to be part of this installation. Could you do that?" And he and I said, "Yeah, sure." And that encouragement, that opening, made it so that I could see myself as an artist and do the work that I'm continuing to do now, to kind of continue to honor his legacy. I would not be an artist without Carlos Villa. Full stop.
I'm a little shorter. Thanks, Rianne. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Eliza Barrios. So how I met Carlos, ironically enough, I moved up from San Diego, getting my undergrad at SFSU. Yeah. And at the time I was married, and my husband was like, "You should meet a guy. He does Filipino arts at Art Institute." And being, an undergrad, circa 1990, 91, having this institution like the Art Institute, it was kind of, "Are you sure he's going to talk to me? I don't know if he's going to talk to me." He's like, "Yeah, I'll just give him your number. We met him because so-and-so." Anyways, he gave Carlos my number. It was exactly the same time that he was organizing the Filipino Arts Exposition, right before Yerba Buena was actually open for business. Yeah. And we were planning for the festival, and it was a behemoth. It was the first time I know of an organized, all the above arts in one jam-packed time. It was theater, it was symposiums, it was art exhibition, it was, yeah, it was all the above. Anyways, I helped him out. 5 a.m. calls, that was me. Always very calm, and we executed on that exhibit. I thought it was really successful. We still have the Pistahan today. That is, as I think yearly we celebrate that. That's resonance from the exhibit. But during the planning, Carlos, because I came out, Carlos wanted me to moderate the gay symposium. And I was totally baby dyke at the time and a little scared to be on that podium. So Rico Reyes, another person, probably has millions of stories to share with you, came out and helped moderate that panel. And what had happened with that was that Carlos saw me as queer, saw me as an artist, saw me as someone that was going into grad school, which was Mills. You know, I actually was inspired to go to Mills because of Carlos, because of Johanna Poitig, because of all the artists that were still practicing at that time. And so that sort of relationship continued. And he definitely believed in what I was doing. Allison was talking about imposter syndrome. I come from a family that, you know, high school education was the highest education my parents had. No one had a graduate degree. No one actually was in art. Come from a military family. And so he really saw that in me. And I actually, gosh, I'm so grateful for his presence. His generosity connected me with these, my sisters. We've been collaborating forever. We lasted longer than the Beatles. Like, come on, here. But I just, you know, that's my story about Carlos. Never ending, still giving. I see the different generations, and it's amazing. And I think he would be smiling right now.
I think so.
Thank you.
We don't have a huge amount of time. I just want to check PJ on how many minutes we have. Okay, PJ just said 5. Inder just said 0. Okay, we've got 5. And so I can bring the microphone to you if you have a memory of Carlos. Oh, why, it's Johanna Potig. Why did I walk?
I met Carlos well, actually, I grew up in the Philippines. So when I came to San Francisco, the first person I called was Carlos. And I was just a little baby graduate from Santa Cruz, and he was so encouraging. I don't think he knew what to do with me exactly. Like, you know, he was like, you know, but so thoughtful. I went on to paint Lakas ng Bayanan and Ang Lipi ni Lapu-Lapu, some major murals, and eventually he brought me to his class at SFII, where I met Jennifer and so many people in that class. And then time passed, and I actually went to Mills Graduate School and was his TA. And the thing that I really just loved about the way he taught and the way he worked with these young students was that free-form thing. You got into the class and you're like, what is the structure of this class? You know, like, what's going on? But he had everybody do manifestos, and it was so successful because he really knew how to bring everybody into the conversation. Nobody was left out. And he brought these students and the people that he knew to themselves, to their own vision, to their own, political longings, to their own story, in the context of that bigger story of worlds in collision. But he really was able to bring it home to people, and he certainly did that for me in acknowledging my work. And so I'm forever grateful, and just seeing his face up here today really brings a tear to my eye that he's not still with us. So thank you.
Thank you. We maybe have time for one other remembrance, and I also think that these conversations are supposed to continue intimately and in perpetuity, forever and ever and ever. So, anybody just burning with one thing they'd like to say about Carlos? Yes?
I'm short too. My name is Emil de Guzman, and I go back with Carlos to 1969. He was my landlord, and he was a professor at California State University at Sacramento. And I just remember him as a guy who had really long curly hair. He really looked like a hippie, but he was traveling back and forth between Sacramento and where we lived on Grove Street. So I got to know him, but it was years later when I began to, I kind of met Carlos again at that first Filipino exposition, but we had a big disagreement, and that is that one of the exhibits that they had was the I Hotel, and they had a place that kind of resembles a room. Now, I was the president of the International Hotel Tenants Association at the time of the eviction in 1977, and then subsequently in 1994 got back involved to try to get the new International Hotel up, which Ms. Potig was really instrumental in getting a beautiful mural up. So she should be given congratulations for having that as a way of being able to memorialize the tenants. But it was really that kind of disagreement that I forgave him, and we can continue to keep going. But I do want to point out one thing. There is only one Filipino in the Smithsonian today, and his name is Leo Valador, who was a contemporary of Carlos. And I'm always rooting for Carlos to be the second Filipino. I mean, an American genre of art that is only had one Filipino, to me, is really a very sad statement about American art. And we need to enshrine people like Carlos. So I think we should, try to keep that in mind and try to do what you can to be able to memorialize, because we have a lot of great artists, just that we're not getting into that institution. Thank you.
Thank you for letting us steal a few minutes for Talk Story. And again, please keep sharing these stories with each other. Carlos's legacy is really deep and long, and we just need to honor it. PJ, did you want to take over from here?
When I think of Carlos and Carlos' work, it's really about building conversations, building coalition, and building worlds and universes when there was none that people said or thought could be. So today I'm really excited to bring in our next panel, moderated by Viet Lee. Viet is an academic, an artist, a writer, and curator whose work centers on spiritualities, trauma, representation, and sexualities, with a focus on Southeast Asia and its diasporas. Dr. Lee is the author of Return Engagements, Contemporary Arts Traumas of Modernity and History in Saigon and Phnom Penh from Duke University, the art book White Gaze, a collaboration with Latipa from Sming Sming Books. Lee has presented his work at the Ban Viet Center, Bangkok Art and Cultural Center, Shanghai Biennale, the Rio Gay Film Festival, the Smithsonian, among other venues. Viet has also curated Charlie Don't Surf at the Center A in Vancouver, Transpop Korea Vietnam Remix with Yung Sun Min at Arco in Seoul, Gallery Queen, Saigon, UC Irvine Gallery, and YBCA in San Francisco. the 2012 Kwandu Biennale in Taipei, and directed the 2015 International Southeast Asian Film Festival. Lee is an associate professor in history of art and visual culture and visual critical studies at the California College of the Arts, and a board member of the Queer Cultural Center and Art Matters. And Viet, come up and we'll introduce the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Hi all. It's an honor to be here to honor Carlos Villa, and I could feel the love for Carlos, but also Carlos's love, his presence in the room as well. First, let me introduce my two fantastic panelists in alphabetical order. Irina Alejo is an artist, researcher, and educator whose work incorporates performativity, social practice, and public space to center and respond to care, community action, and cultural preservation. They are third-generation San Francisco renter with family, documented to a history of renting 2015 ongoing, their long-term multi-platform project and first photography book through Clamshell Press and Catalog Projects 2020. Alejo has presented at Kearney Street Workshop, American Studies Association, and has their work acquired by SF MoMA. Alejo administers grants for the Office of the Vice President for the Arts at Stanford University. Next panelist is Kathy Zurer, who is an associate professor of art history at Skyline College and a curator and culture worker in the San Francisco Bay Area. Zura's exhibition considers topics that relate to land and place, such as belonging, indigeneity, diaspora, migration, and alliance building. With Jacqueline Francis, who's here in the audience today, and my colleague, who we all love, has curated exhibitions for the San Francisco Arts Commission and Museum of the African Diaspora. She has also curated exhibitions hosted by SOMARTS and Minnesota Street Project. In addition to her curatorial work, Zura organizes conferences about art history and pedagogy, including Chinese painting here, then and now, SF State University / Asian Art Museum 2020, and teaching art of the Middle East and Islamic world at San Francisco University and also the De Young 2017. She has written essays for the Wattis Institute, Art in America, and Broad Street. Zura holds a PhD in art history and a certificate in museum studies from the University of Michigan. Please welcome Kathy and Irina. So as they come up, the panel discussion is entitled The Future of Hope, Legacy, and Lineage. And I was really thinking about how to respond in times of crisis then and now. And I feel Carlos was such a pioneer and a visionary. And of course, we're still in a state of crisis, but how do we respond with care, with intimacy, thinking through materials, magic, community building, and as PJ was saying, world making. So we, in our pre-conversation meeting, we talked about different clusters of keywords. One is creative and critical practices, connection and distance, and cross-ethnic coalitions. So we'll be unpacking these themes, and of course, if you have questions, please, interject. Thank you. And this clicker works too, so if you want. So the first question is around creative and critical practices. And we're really interested, actually, I've been a fan of both of your works for a long time. And so I wanted to start off and ground us in Kathy's and Irina's amazing work. And so we talked about just sharing really briefly a couple of your projects that respects or reflects aspect of Carlos's ethos, whether it be radical pedagogies, because you're both, I feel, like activist educators through your different interdisciplinary works, sustaining disparate communities, and challenging artistic boundaries. And also to further ground Carlos's practice, many of you have seen his work here. He used quote-unquote unconventional materials such as capes, feathers, and masks, magic amidst modernism's long shadow, which disavows these other worlds, these other materials. So the question is about grounding us in your own practice, but also thinking about how you intervene and how you reinscribe, resistance, however you frame it, within your own practices. So we have a magic clicker, and we can ground it in however.
Do you want to start, Kathy? Let's see. Surprise! Oh, it's mine. Hi, everyone. My name is Irina, and I really appreciate you all being here. And I also am so inspired from the morning panel and just this incredible retrospective of an artist who I have never met in my lifetime, but I have so much gratitude for because of everyone who has mentored me also has been connected to Carlos in some way, in some form. I am an artist that looks at social practice and community as a way to, community and public space to think about work. So this slide was my recent exhibition at SF MoMA. And from this talk and from doing some readings on Carlos, I really think about the cross-cultural solidarity he puts in his work. And I also wanted to imbue that in this installation, in this project called My Ancestors Followed Me Here. And it was a study, an examination of Mission Street in San Francisco, where I grew up. I lived across the Mission, the Excelsior, and the South of Market District. I went to school and lived there. And so I was able to interview different muralists and service workers along Mission Street and have different ways to present the works inside the museum at SF MoMA and outside. So this is inside the museum where there are 7 photos, and there's a vitrine of different artifacts and archives. But also, I learned from working with Lian Ladia, who also closely worked with Carlos, how to think about archives. And also, we made a newspaper with Jerlyn Jarun Phillips to distribute across Mission Street, because we want to make sure that these histories are accessible outside of institutions. And it makes me think a lot earlier when Kathy and I were walking and looking at Carlos's work in the morning, I was just in tears because of how it was told to him that Filipino-American art history, Filipino history did not exist for him. And so he really found a way to see beyond what his mentors and his institutions think about that. And I also thought about Theo Gonzalez's introduction where he quotes Avery Gordon about, the role of a scholar is to think about who's not here, the absence. And so Carlos's work thinks about that. How do we bring together people who are street scholars, people who are in the institutions? And my work is also inspired by that. And I'll pass it to Kathy, since it's a back and forth conversation.
Thanks. Thank you, Viet, and thank you, Irina. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And this morning's panel was very moving, and I, listening to that panel, I was like, oh yeah, I know why I got invited. Not only because my mentors were working with him, for example, I think here we have Mark Johnson. I've done a lot of work with him. We co-curated an exhibition at San Francisco State, but also in thinking about the holes in the art historical record, who's included, who's not included. And so Mark and I worked together very diligently on exhibitions, but also conferences about how to teach, in particular, topics that are very, very, at this point in time and for many years, tricky. For example, contemporary art in the Arab world, right? You think about that. And you immediately conjure images of the veil or terrorism. And I hope we've moved a little bit past that, but I don't think so. Because many of the teachers were like, oh, I didn't, oh, that's new to me. So, and then reading Words in Collision, the exchange Carlos Villa had with Reagan Louie, I was thinking to myself how little has changed. One of the things, and I was like, I'm going to check and see. One of the things that he said was that at the Worlds in Collision symposia, there weren't any white men in the audience. And that's not all the way true right now, but it's almost true. And so I think that this work continues. Anyways, I will talk about what is on the screen right now.
I really love this. I actually brought my students to see, my middle school students. This was at MOAD?
Yeah.
I saw this as well. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I mean, Jackie Francis and I curated this in 2016, and I always had a hard time pinpointing what this show was about, and so I keep coming back to it, even though we've curated something together since then. This show is called Where is Here? It's at the Museum of the African Diaspora, and we were thinking about our relationships to place, where we belong, where we maybe don't belong or don't quite fit, or where I was thinking a lot about, for example, at the time we were hearing a lot in the news about how the population of African American people in San Francisco was reducing, and we were thinking well, what is this? This is the museum about the diaspora, and let's talk about very specific things. At the same time that we might address something broad. And so I can talk about each of these works, but I maybe will talk about, actually I'm gonna talk about a non-object work of art, which is a song, 2 songs. We had music playing in the gallery on headphones by the Brown Fellinis, who, if you all know or don't know, yeah, Brown Fellinis, yeah. They're badass. Really hard to describe their music. It's a fusion of jazz and punk and rock, and there's some spoken word. And they formed in San Francisco 1990, 1991. One of the songs that we played is called 859 Scott. And without revealing too much about their lives, it's an important place because they played and they made a lot of their music at 859 Scott in San Francisco. That song is instrumental. It is without lyrics. And if you walked into that gallery, you wouldn't necessarily be able to say, oh yeah, a Black artist made that. Somebody from the African diaspora made that. We weren't interested necessarily in something that had a specific connection to what we think is, Black or Arab or, generally speaking. So the works tended to be more conceptual, and yet they were still quite rooted in the experience, for example, of being Trinidadian, or from Trinidad. Yeah, so I feel like I could keep going on, but please do. So I'll just talk about one more artwork here, which is Christopher Cozier. It's the artwork that's on the floor. And Christopher Cozier is from Trinidad, and this artwork is called Pira. And Pira is a Hindi-derived word that means bench. And so his work really, it's interesting because his parents they worked with the colonial government. And so he grew up with access to office supplies. So a lot of his work, this in particular, is made out of very typical materials. So unfortunately, I didn't include a detail, but what we have here are small pieces of cardboard with stamped with an image of a small bench, overlaid with a colonial map, and they're standing up with binder clips, and they're like an army of benches. But it's the layering of experience. It's the layering of the languages in the Caribbean. It's the layering of this movement of populations through the colonial, the British colonial need for cheap labor throughout the world. And so this show continues to give. I don't know if you feel the same way about it, Jackie. I go back to it a lot. There's another exhibition I can talk about, but I feel like maybe. Oh,
should I?
Okay, no, great.
No? Is it this? Sorry.
Oh, it is this.
This
yeah,
one?
it is this.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, so this is a work from an exhibition called Between Scapes at Soma Arts. I was working with Kearney Street Workshop and Asian Pacific Islander Cultural Center, and it's hosted at Soma Arts. And I curated this with Rula Seikali. I prefer to curate in collaboration, so I think that's another thing that I picked up from, inadvertently, because I didn't know Carlos. Collaboration as methodology. This particular image highlights the work of Weston Turuya, who created this sculpture based on a photograph of 3 people who were involved in the Third World Student Liberation Movement at UC Berkeley in San Francisco State. And he used a tradition of lamp making in Japan to create these hands. The photograph had the three men, one Asian, one African American, and one Japanese American. They were collaborating together for the Third World Liberation Movement. So, but what was missing was a Native woman who was also part of this movement, who was also part of the takeover of Alcatraz. So he took this material form and made this sort of fragile sculpture, and it was fragile. We were worried about transporting it, just to talk about the challenges of cross-cultural connections and collaborations, because people do get left out. So I think I'll stop with that. Thanks.
I love, thank you, Kathy and Irina. And I love, Irina, what you said in connecting to this morning's panel about street scholarship and both of your works, being within this physical white cube space, but then also beyond it, right? Connecting with the communities of the mission, and then also what you mentioned about Avery Gordon, this idea of hauntology, this ever absence and presence. This ghostly haunting, real and imagined. So I think it's reflected in some of this work. I think I have a couple of images just in the spirit of sharing here. So this was a show called Trans Pop Korea Remix, which I co-curated with Young Soon Min. But how many of you are into K-pop? Maybe not, it's okay. I'm not a biggest fan either. But just thinking about Worlds in Collision, Young Soon Min, who is a Korean American artist, was meeting with me about her love of K-pop then. This was about more than 10 years ago. But what we know of K-pop now, this kind of, I'm trying to look like a BTS member today channel. But it was actually, a lot of scholars talk about how it was actually housed. The roots of K-pop was grounded in American imperialism, that Americans paid Korean mercenary soldiers billions of dollars to fight in the Vietnam War, and they're, from Japanese imperialism, also quite brutal. And so this blood money paid for the groundwork that was reinvested within the Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Pan-Asian cultural production. So it emerges as what we see as K-pop and K-beauty today. And of course, there's a lot of Korean, Vietnamese, Pan-Asian investment within the region. So the show was about that, this still present past. And so it was because of this show that I started being obsessed with K-pop and also making music videos and experimental films, etc. So both my academic work, my book, Return Engagements, talks about the specter of the past, this return, what happens when trauma is ever present, how do you wrestle with it? And this goes to our second question. And then my work, my experimental artwork, is really about not reinforcing what I call this pornography of violence, right? But really about thinking other strategies. And For instance, one of my videos tries to put the camp in refugee camp. I don't know if it's successful or not, but you can check it out on YouTube. But so the next question is really thinking about connections and distances, because for, oops, I messed up the PowerPoint. Okay, Carlos is back. Yes. So that we were talking in our pre-meeting about this idea of how often we're expected to represent certain communities based upon our geopolitical affiliations or disidentifications. But then this is from your terminology, this idea of connection and distance, but sometimes we feel distance from that. And then we talked about the politics of identity and our affiliations, perceived or not. Sometimes, I'm Vietnamese American, but oftentimes I'm called to represent Vietnam in different capacities. So it presents both opportunities and challenges. So I'm just going to read a real quick quote. And so just as a quick background in thinking about Carlos, and you can see the timeline downstairs, but in a 95 oral history interview housed at the Smithsonian, Carlos Villa, quote, recalls his first show at Poindexter in New York, his associations with minimalists and the Park Place group. So he was, in some ways, a formalist, right? Really steeped in this tradition of modernity, art for art's sake. And he needed, actually, to escape this framework, right, which he felt was limiting after 6 years. And as you can see in the timeline before, he comes towards his Philippine X identity a little bit later on. And, quote, he discusses his return to the Bay Area and his use of identity politics as subjects for his art, unquote. So this shift, right, away from this mainstream, I would say there are many art histories and many art worlds, but a very particular hegemonic Euro-American one that is still dominant. So he shifts away from that. So can you speak to wrestling with these kind of dominant frameworks, resisting that, how you feel connected and distanced at the same time in your chosen communities?
Sure, I also want to make this a conversation, so just feel free to just jump in. I think what we were talking about in our call before, because I wanted to, I didn't personally know Carlos, so I only know about Carlos through my work with, community members who are part of Soma Pilipinas, and even before it was called Soma Pilipinas, so I wanted to do more digging on how people know Carlos. And I would like to share, preparation for this call, I talked to Manay Alleluia Panis and also Ate Rachel Lastimosa to ask more about what's their connection to Carlos. And also, I also learned earlier, I know Tito Emil de Guzman shared that Carlos was his landlord. So they're basically also parents of mine who raised me, the de Guzmans. So it's just really interesting to see all these connections. But I wanted to share before that how for the connection and distance that you brought up earlier, Viet, was I wanted to ask more on how my community members knew of Carlos. And so from Manay's work, she was in high school when Carlos was performing at the farm. And so and later on, she also developed her own trajectory and relationship to ritual and practice and indigeneity. But then how she credits Carlos is that Carlos was able to break into the mainstream. And I think that's so significant in terms of representation, especially as, it took this long for just an advocacy of a whole team to bring the first retrospective of a Filipino-American artist. It took decades, but the Filipinos are some of the largest population here in the country. So it's just fascinating because I think about Theo Gonzalez's work on how, in his writing of how there's a lot of U.S. guilt with thinking about our colonial past. So sometimes I wonder, does it take so long for us to unlearn our history that we're now able to confront and also celebrate everyone else who has been part of American history? And also I think about that as someone who was born and raised and grew up in a place like Soma, in a place that has been now called part Soma Pilipinas and all these amazing cultural districts in California. So I think a lot about that being boxed in, but also how do we work through and across these differences. It's back to, I think about later in August, I'll be working on I'll be collaborating with related tactics on like their residency at Montalvo Art Center, and they're looking at thick solidarity. So with that, I think a lot about how I sit here because of so many people who have been connected to Carlos, and not just Carlos, Carlos's contemporaries also. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Kathy, and I'll definitely want to make this a conversation because this is in our call. I was learning from both of you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Irina. I was, when you sent the questions via, I thought a lot about, and this keeps coming up today, how Carlos's professor said there is no Filipino art history, and how I was able to relate to that when I was applying for graduate school, because there were no scholars who were focused on what I wanted to study, which was contemporary art from the Middle East. Turned out to be specifically Arab. And eventually I was like, this is really weird. I mean, I got into the University of Michigan, and it was like quite an effort for the department to try to figure out, well, how can we support the student? None of us here really are, versed in the history, and plus it's a new field, right? So it was a new field. So no one necessarily told me, oh, there is no art history. But it was a new field, and so that was very challenging. At some point, I started feeling, I don't know if this was part of my own imposter syndrome, like, did I get into graduate school because I myself am an Arab woman who wants to study Arab art? And I felt really weird about that. Like I had to perform something specific. And then being from the diaspora, I was born in San Francisco, I didn't feel like I had the cred, like I never lived through war, I don't wear the veil, like all those things that were, like, oh, the suffering, right? It seems like the art world really likes to see people express how they suffer, Forget that. So actually, that's what I ended up writing about in my dissertation. I didn't write about women, I wrote about men. And I wrote, so like everything in my life, I'm like, oh yeah, that was kind of interesting. I wonder what I was really trying to get out there, because it's constantly unfolding. That's how I think, that's how my brain works. So my dissertation was about how artists are representing themselves in self-portraiture in a context, in an art world context that was eager for that kind of performance of identity. And what I saw was that all these artists were referencing European art history, which I think is really funny, right? So they're using all these strategies and tactics that came from art history before, the art history that they learned, right? It was the art history that they learned. And today, I'm really happy to say there are tons of scholars in universities who are working on modern art from the Middle East, which is like, like modern, anything not European was always seen as derivative. Like, here's the Sudanese Picasso about Ibrahim al-Salehi, right? Which makes me want to gag, to be honest with you. But, there are scholars who are writing very, very carefully about that. And so, yeah, today I feel like I'm not necessarily, I don't think I stand for that whole culture, at least in my community here. I'm seen as someone who can contribute in a broad way, and I have to say that that's because of of the art world that people like Carlos Villa have really shaped. One that's about alliances and cross-cultural connections and things like that.
I agree with you, Kathy. I'm done with the suffering. No more suffering. No more spectacles of suffering, right? This kind of image, this barrage of violence that you think of, let's say, any war that U.S. empire is complicit in. It's always this kind of other that's spectacularized. And also within the art world, for instance, I do a lot of scholarship on Cambodian art. But oftentimes, having lived in Cambodia for a long time, what's expected of Khmer art is usually, what you associate in the imaginary of Cambodia or Vietnam or Southeast Asia, this violence, either the spectacularized violence. So the most famous artists deal with basically this long lineage of war. So again, done with the suffering, onto, as Carlos Villa's legacy is about healing and community. But also what you're talking about in terms of honor or debt from this morning's panel, Utang versus Atang, and forgive me for paraphrasing this idea of debt versus honor, but also to think of Mimi Thuy Nguyen's work in terms of refugees, right? There were always kind of, or anybody, immigrant, there were always indebted. There's also this entire eternal performance of debt and gratitude, and what is extracted is kind of this blood debt of empire. So this in some ways is reflected within institutions. So the second part of the question is, how do you wrestle with both your individual desires as your own complex subjectivities, but also the institutional desires, what the institution wants, because the institution sometimes wants a certain kind of checkbox or a certain kind of, I would say diversity, this additive model is not enough. There can be a critical mass, but as long as the foundational structure doesn't change, right, that's not enough. And I'll shut up in a bit, but Mark Johnson, our colleague, Margot Machida, says that we're the termites of art history, right? That we, in our collective work, undermine the foundation and are creating a new foundation. That's not referencing, I'm not saying decolonial everything, because the history is, we are complicit in colonization itself, right? So I'm not saying throw out everything and undermine everything, but how do you, again, wrestle with kind of your individual wants and, place, et cetera, with the kind of institutional wants and desires?
Do you want me to? I can.
I'm not ready to.
Okay, so I can. I'm going to go back to my slide on my work, so I can share more. So one example is working with SF MoMA. I was really grateful to work with Lindy Lettinen and Sally Katz as the curators that Adrian Burrell and I worked with. Adrian represented, the Oakland part of the Bay Area Walls Commission, and we learned so much from his work. And then I was grateful to think about my relationship with San Francisco for that commission. And this was, Bay Area Walls was the museum's response to the pandemic. And I remember that Lindy and Sally were really great in advocating for my request to use most of my stipend to pay all my collaborators. I had a long list of collaborators, and I think I learned a lot about this from Ate Allison at PEP, honestly, Pinoy Pinay Educational Partnerships, and having worked with Diana Lee, Erwin Simpello, and Dara Del Rosario, part of Soma Pagmahal Photo Mentorship Program when I worked at Galing Bata bilingual after-school program in south of Market, of thinking about who else can we include in our work to uplift. And I mean, that's so much in line with Carlos being able to connect and coordinate so many different people, 5 a.m. calls. I did not have that with my collaborators, but I was able to really think about who else can I bring onto this commission, because this is such a shared experience, and how can we take over the museum to just thrive, and yeah, no more suffering. But we did look at what suffering was, during the pandemic, but we were able to just, we paid all the people we interviewed, even folks who didn't make it to the final work, paid, we had to ask the museum, what's we referenced, if you've ever heard of Wage, that's the website where you reference like how much do you pay an artist for a project. And especially as, you know, we're unearthing a lot during this pandemic of how much do we, what is our labor worth? And I thought a lot about that in this commission. And so I wanted to make sure that it was beyond me being there to uplift other people. But I also thought about my relationship to institutions in this personal work that I did. I actually asked Kathy over Facebook, like in 2019, because then this is a personal work called Scatter Piece, and I think there's getting some feedback. But this trash can is just right down where the block from where my mom, my brother, and I live, and where my grandparents also lived with us. This trash can oversees this luxury development that's already now being built. And previously, this trash can was overlooking a preschool. So I wanted to think about my brother, who's a tenants' rights counselor, was organizing with Poder SF, Communities United in Health and Justice, and other organizations, grassroots organizations in San Francisco, to go to City Hall and, you know, appeal this luxury development that was going to be built. And I'm trying to figure out what my role is as an artist in giving voice to this lot that was going to change, that is changing our environment in terms of gentrification and displacement. And so I thought about this poem that I wrote back in 2016 when my aunt, my late aunt, Zenaida Perez, was evicted after her death in the mission. And I wanted to translate that to the different languages spoken in the Excelsior. So I also messaged Kathy is there, someone I could say in terms of like Arab languages that are spoken. I wasn't able to translate it into the different Arab languages, but then there's Vietnamese, there's Tagalog, there's Ilocano, there's French, there's Spanish. So I was able to translate that poem referencing, this luxury development, or this thing that was going to change our neighborhood into that. And so this piece was called Scatter Piece, and I basically scattered these multi-language poems in the block in my whole neighborhood for like every week for about for about 3 months. And I was also going through a lot of grief during that time, so it was just very meditative to think about. It's different from the collective work that I did with SF MoMA and other works that I do in community, but this was a personal work that I think about, and a ritual. So I wanted to share this work in reference to, thinking about Carlos's ritual work, and just also what's our kalolooban, what's our inner life, what's the depth. And so I really thank you all, and also Kathy for helping me, also just being part of that intersection.
Can I ask you a question? How did you get into the work of art and activism? It seems interconnected in your...
Yeah, I'd love to ask you. I know that we have questions, but I'd also love... I'm finally sitting with like 2 people I've just looked up to. I learned about Viet's work back in 2016 through Aperture, and I recently was able to watch his talk in Venice at like 8 a.m. here. So it's just an honor to be here, and also to listen to the panelists this morning. I really credit my mom, who's here in the audience, who's met some of my friends already here. If you have been to our house, if you have not been to our house, you'll be at our house. I know there's, and I think a lot about my mom, who was a student activist during the time of the Marcos dictatorship, when she was a UP Diliman student, and whenever she lectures me and my brother, she has this whole like Filipino psychology, because she was a student of Virgilio Enriquez, who who I guess is quoted the Filipino, the father of father of Filipino psychology. But then we think a lot about what kapwa is and what is community engaged scholarship. So I credit that to my mom, and also being connected to the Soma community since I was very young in first grade, because she would take us to all sorts of city hall hearings. When our school was, Filipino Education Center was being threatened of being closed down, and working with Tita Magdalena de Guzman on just different things. So I'm just really, those are my activist roots, but I think about it in this community and ecosystem that I was just grateful to be raised in. And I want to ask you both that same question too.
I was going to ask Kathy. I want to hear.
Well, I don't really see myself as an activist, although sometimes people call me an activist. I'm like, oh, I don't do nearly enough to...
I feel the same, honestly.
Really? That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, my family, I feel like no one in my family was in the arts. My uncle, my father's brother, was an activist for Palestinian freedom. But generally speaking, my family is not really involved in art or activism. And so I was... So I've been just trying to figure it out on my own. I do recall a drawing that I made when I was very little of a woman in a very long dress, and apparently that's what artists look like, and that's what I wanted to be when I grew up, right? I knew when I was a kid I wanted to be an artist. That didn't quite work out. I went the art historian route after a lot of back and forth and trying and changing my mind and going to college and dropping out of college and going back to college and then getting a PhD. I always tell my students, I'm a college dropout and I have a PhD, because there's so many different routes to get to where we are. Hi, Tarani. And yeah, but I think, maybe just, earlier the panel, there was a lot of conversation about community, and even though I feel like a bit of a recluse at times, it is through the relationships that I've made with you all that I've been able to sustain my practice as a curator.
I'm also a college dropout and also a high school dropout, yet I have 2 masters and a PhD. But part of that was because I was a Vietnamese boat refugee. Half the people that escaped by boat died, and actually there's a lot of connections to current refugees today, that there's this discourse of fear and terror, and when we came, nobody wanted us because of this fear of communism. So there was no roadmap for me as a young queer Vietnamese, just only kind of images of model minoritiness. And I feel my path into activism was basically one of care, right? There's the root word of curate is care as well. So it's basically caring about, I remember growing up like, oh, I wish I grew up among other artists and people who made art. And I started drawing because my uncle drew, and it was the cheapest thing, paper and pencil. But then now I'm among all of you, which is like, I'm living the dream, these creative folks and who are engaged in community. And I also feel that all work is political. It references, it reflects the social, geopolitical aspects of that time and place, but it could also envision other futurities, which I think all of our work does. So this brings us to the third question, and then we'll open up to audience questions, this idea of worlds in collision and cross-ethnic coalitions. So Carlos Villa's artistic, pedagogical, and activist practice transcends transcultural connections across generations and geographies, as the curators of the exhibition put it. Post-colonial scholar Lisa Lowe calls this an intimacy of 4 continents. I love this term because she says that basically what we think of as separate sufferings, and I'm not against suffering, I'm saying that I'm against the spectacle of suffering, that it's important to kind of own this grief, right? And sometimes our grief is embodied and intergenerational and transgenerational, but it doesn't ever necessarily resolve, right? But Lisa Lowe says this intimacy of core continents, what you think as separate suffering, indigenous genocide, displacement here, wars, etc. They're actually grounded by a foundational structural violence. And so at the same time, it's also a possibility for radical hope and change. So what worlds, words, and worlding do you hope to put into collision and re-envision?
I made a list. It's a short list, but it's a list. Okay. So regarding leadership, I have a desire to re-envision more women, BIPOC people, and I'm thinking a lot about the Berkeley Art Center and Kim Arteche and Elena Gross taking on a co-curator role there, and I think that's great. And it happened because people stepped aside, so that needs to happen as well. I'm not pointing fingers, I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you've had a job for 30 or 40 years, maybe you should step aside. The other thing, I always put my foot in my mouth, it's just part of my personality. Okay, the other thing is about resources. So I want to put, you like that? I want to put capitalism into collision with sharing. There's no reason why somebody should have billions and billions of dollars when others are sleeping on the street. Related, economically sustainable arts, right? There's no reason why anyone should work their ass off for free, unless they want to. And then, this is personal for me. I was just talking earlier about got a little bit of imposter syndrome about writing, but I produce ideas and knowledge and content through my curatorial work. So I'd like for that to be counted. God damn it. I know where all this intensity is coming from, but here it is. I thought I was going to be crying up here, but yeah, no, apparently I'm demanding. Okay, so the other thing that I wrote down, to re-envision how to teach art history surveys. So we were talking about the canon earlier, and I'm still trying to figure it out because I have, right now I'm sort of taking the, let's insert some Filipino content in my Asia survey class. But I don't know if that, that's not enough, I don't think. So I want to re-envision, and then regarding colonialism and settler colonialism, I think that, we need to stop ignoring that happened, right? We need to stop ignoring the original sin in this country and other places as well, because, I think a lot of times people talk about slavery as the original sin, but before that, there was the genocide and displacement of Native people. And we need to think about that. How does that impact what we think our role is here? And then also me, I'm the daughter of immigrants, right? So I myself am a settler, and so what is my job in redressing that? And then the last point, I wasn't sure if I was going to say this, but I'm kind of on a roll. So regarding dirty laundry, I think we need to address the shame of our dirty laundry, and maybe bring it into collision with some hardcore compassion.
I think yes to all of that. I didn't come up with a list, but I just have, for me, I work at an institution in grants, and sometimes I wonder, do grants have to exist? Is there a way to rethink about how we make work? I think, and also how can we just have I mean, in Tagalog, there's this word called hanap buhay, and it means, in roughly English, it can mean work, but then also it can mean labor, and it can also mean, just your life, your hanap buhay. So I just think about, like, how can we just have a livable, how can we just live in full beyond just wages? Or, I think, like, I've been thinking a lot about communalism and just the different ways people live. So, I think for me as a perpetual renter with my family, will that change? Will this change of my life, the state of my life change if I ended up being a homeowner? Those are things that I think about. Will it change? Will it improve? I'm not really sure. So, yeah, I think about just the different ways we think about stability and also funding, because back to my work in the arts at Stanford, I think people have sometimes students have different ways of thinking about funding of, I need $50,000 to, make like a theater production versus, for me, I worked out of just very little. That's why I think my work is always, and also I don't have a lot of space in my house. That's why I work in social practice. I don't have to keep things. Actually, some things are, like those photos at SF MoMA, I had to take some home, so right now they're just kind of cramping up my room, which is my studio, I guess, too. But I just think about how do we, how do we think about funding? I think one leader for that, honestly, is a place like APIC, API Cultural Center, where they're re-granting and they're really thinking about how to create this ecosystem for artists in San Francisco, for Asian American artists, or artists making projects related to being a United States of Asian America. So those are just some imaginations that I think about. Also, another thing, I think for me as a queer person, I was having this conversation with my best friend who's bisexual, and she was saying, I'm gonna get married to my girlfriend, but my in-laws to be are arguing about, like, who's gonna wear the dress? Which one of you are gonna wear the dress? And then, I was just so upset with that, because I was like, Virgie, like, sometimes, like, people who think about in these, like, heterosexist frameworks don't have imagination, so they end up trying to think about inserting their imagination onto other people's lives. So I think just thinking about beyond that framework of, like, straight versus, so those are just things that I am continuing to think through.
And then the beyond heteronormative or homonormative, but of course artists imagine other worlds. So the last thing I really want to ask, and it's related to the last panel when they were talking about healing, that I really wanted to ask you about spirituality, healing, shamanism. Just to put it in context, Hal Foster was talking about this kind of ethnic turn or identity politics in the 90s, which work was really there was a call to action because the museums, the Whitney Biennial, et cetera, didn't reflect artists of color, and there's still this gender, racial, sexual void. But there's been some redress of that. But then now there's this term called the global turn in terms of there's more representation, more attention to the rest of the world, but still, and more focus on other practices away from modernism towards materials, metaphysics. So, for instance, I was just in Venice for this talk, but then there was this whole section about spirituality, and in the 2017 biennial, there's this weird, Christine Marchell curated this pavilion of shamans, right? And so this kind of shamanistic work has been reiterating from the 60s, 70s today, but there is another moment because I feel there is a moment of crisis and people are looking towards the spiritual. I think that's important, but then it's problematic when it's commoditized in this way, right? But so I was just trying to think through, and Carlos Villa actually has been really important in my own work and my own healing and my own spirituality and thinking about other worlds and other modalities and other modes of healing. So just any wisdom you can share with us about spirituality, healing, being whole?
I feel a little bit nervous about that coming into an art space, because I know, because of the connection to the market. And so I'm not totally sure what to do with that. I will say, though, that the work of artists like Carlos says is, I mean, I went downstairs and I saw the capes and I saw the mask and the artist's feet, and there was something really, really strong there. And if I'm gonna have access to that in a museum, then I'll take it. But I wonder if there's a way to expand access to that, and it'd be really interesting to see. I mean, I have become more spiritual as I've gotten older. I used to poo-poo it because I associated it with religion, which I associated with oppression. But I'm kind of coming up with my own way of connecting with the divine, and it's very personal and unique.
Yeah, I think in relation to that question, but also what I wasn't able to bring up earlier, was my conversation with Viet before this panel on reorienting our relationship to the museum collections. I mean, I'm bringing up some notes of my call with Alleluia Panis and Rachel Lastimosa, and these are some notes that we talked about of, just even being here at Asian Art Museum, direct quote, a white person's fetishization of Orientalism. And there are some, I think it's great to think about Carlos's work being in this space because it's a document of performances and works that change and reorient our ways of thinking about what is in a museum. I know too that the Asian Art Museum is working to repatriate objects as well and get community voices into getting, I mean, I'm learning that some of the collections are city owned, so it gives a lot of voice to folks here in the city to say, oh, this is what I want to do with these pieces in this museum. How can we have our voices? How can we have a say? And so that's a big step that some of the collection, I know in 2019, was repatriated back to Thailand. I mean, another thing too is how, I was just so floored by Manai's ritual this morning with the performers, because of how they wanted to change our relationship to the objects of worship housed in this museum. I think the direct quote, Manai describes these as, objects of worship encapsulated and engraved. There's a certain sterility to it. And so by having this ritual earlier this morning, and I know Rachel will close with it later, we want to think about how these objects are actually still used in practice and say even my own culture, like in my house, there's like the whole Jesus communal feasting thing. So I think it's whether or not whatever my relationship to that object is, I think a lot about this is the culture that I come from, and this is how my people value these, and it's different from how I'm seeing it in a museum.
Thank you, Irina and Kathy. We would like now to open it to audience questions, comments, wisdom, life hacks.
Hi, thank you for that. I am very excited to be here and listening to these very intelligent humans. My name is Kinjin Montoya. In my own research, Carlos Villa has also been so key and center, also as someone who's never met him, only the people that I go to for so much. bring him up in some way in research, in life, and in my love of art. So my question is to Irina and Kathy as educators, in the way that we have been learning even earlier, the way that Carlos steps outside of the canon, wants people to think, specifically his students and his mentees, to think outside of what's been structured for us in academia, in art, and a tie into this idea of the spirituality. Can you tell me your relationship to the non-linear, right? So the canon and academia have a hierarchical archive. They have exactly linear time looks like this. This is who got there first. This is who got there second. And I know as a Mexican Chinese person, the stories that I hear about the way the world works, a lot of time are not linear, and there's magic involved. I've heard words like ritual. I've heard words, that I think don't really fit in the canon in that way, right? But it's important to us to think about, like you said, the way space gets changed when the knowledge is embodied, and we're not reading a history, but we're like learning from people's bodies and the way we take up space. Those things are not Western ideas. All of that to say, if you think about that at all in your classrooms, how do you communicate that with your students? This idea of, we're in this academic space, but I want you to know that there's a different way of thinking about these things. Does that make sense? Okay.
I could start, but also, I think, Kathy and Viet can also answer these, as putting you on the spot as also educators. I think for me as a Filipino person, time is circular, and even Tagalog, what I speak, is also very circular. So I think it's just coming to surprises of, I think even say asking for directions of like, hey, I'm trying to go to the museum. Do you know where it is? Oh no, you're almost there. Don't worry, you're almost there. Or I'm trying to answer your question in terms of being open to what comes. I think when I work with, I don't really directly work with students anymore, even though I'm at a university, but my direct experience was working with middle school students at Denman through PEP, and also at Galing Bata at Bessie Carmichael Filipino Education Center. And I think we did have, we have to learn Common Core and all these things, and they have to make sure they pass their classes and do their homework. But I think one of the most important things that I've also learned from PEP and also from Galing Bata is just taking them outside in their neighborhood and seeing what's across the street, who cuts your hair, like who sells bread, who's at the laundromat, who's working there, who's on shift at 8 a.m. So I think getting to know their immediate neighborhood is the most important thing, because that's where they feel safe and that's where they go to school. And I know that's such a different, it's such a tense environment right now with just the culture of safety in different public spaces. But I think it's back to Carlos, it's like building relationships and being open with the circularity of it.
Thanks, Kinjin. So nice to see you. I'm not sure. Okay, so now I'm currently teaching at a community college, and it's pretty interesting. There's a list of things I'm supposed to teach, and those things, I need to cover them in order for that class to be transferable to San Francisco State, to CSUs and to the UCs. And so that feels very limiting. But my colleagues are like, oh, that's okay. You can teach that however you want. I'm like, oh my God. It scares me, because I feel like I have to kind of take it apart and put it back together again. I'm not sure. I have in other colleges, like at San Francisco State and at CCA, I have taught thematic classes where I had and it was contemporary. But I felt like in that situation that the historical specificity was lost. You know, like we would dip into, you know, Iran in 1979, and we would maybe learn about that moment in the context of what theme was that? I can't remember exactly, but it was a thematic thing. I feel like, and I think it's just me needing to unlearn how I was taught, you know, like mastery, all these things that I don't feel like I'm very good at, you know, and yet I still like hold on to them, and I wonder if that's like, yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Do you want to answer it? You're an amazing educator.
Just briefly, I think we've inherited these theological, you know, these straight, and I mean it, you know, heteronormative, but also homonormative timelines. We have to do certain things on a micro and macro level. You know, as individuals, you need to follow this thing to be an adult and to succeed. But, you know, I'm really interested in ideas of failure. Jack Halberstam writes about it. But then also, there's this whole linear narrative, colonial narrative of progress. Certain countries are progressing or developing, and I don't believe that, right? Because, frankly, you know, the quote-unquote first world looks like a shithole. How do we have unhoused folks, right? And the first world and third world, quote-unquote, commingle, and there's global south and global north, and there are many worlds in collision. And so how do we think of these timelines and the circularities? You know, I was looking for a spiritual teacher for a long time, but sometimes our spiritual, conceptual, rational teachers, right, aren't in our face living, but sometimes there could be people like Carlos that are disembodied. So what are other timelines? And there have been scientific studies which prove that our ancestral traumas, you know, are present now, right? And they're actually not, it's not a trauma, it's a healing, it's productive, right? You're warned against these things that could be bad for you, like birds, you know, predator, you know. So to think again, when do we return? How do we heal? And it's not a linear progress, right? It's many lifetimes, and it's this lifetime too.
I will say that, like, I do talk to my students about, like, oh, what did you do this weekend? Oh, there's live music. Oh, did you know about this mural? Oh, did you know, like, go out into the world and check it out, check it out. And then also, I just want to say, sort of separate, but I have a plot at a community garden that is, it's where the farm used to be, actually. And it's every time I go there, I'm like, oh, this is historical. No one else really thinks about that, right? But I think sometimes there are things that are going on or that we might not be totally tapped into on an intellectual level, but it's there. And I hope that, you know, like when I talk about power, you know, like, okay, we're in this art history class and we're looking at these objects. Well, that's a symbol of power. And whose objects are we looking at? We're looking at the objects that powerful kings and kingdoms, you know, we're not looking at everyday objects, of everyday people, right? So I like to remind them of that.
Hello, I'm Ben Lagasca. I'm a cousin of a cousin, which means that Carlos and Leo were both my cousin. I'm also third in line of the Corpus family, which means I'm still an existing living artist. There's a lot of things that you guys have said today, as well as the first group, that I've been sitting here just gnawing at myself, rolling in my chair. And there's a lot of things to be said, but we're here to pay homage to Carlos and what he's done. And what he's done is that when he brought World in Collision together, he brought together all the issues of racial issues, discrimination, unfairness, unjustness, things that have gone wrong in this country for people of our color, off color, indigenous people who were first, and the colonials who came over to take away their right to live. And he ate that all up. He sucked it in. We used to have phone calls Saturday morning. I'd call him, and I told him basically in one set of words, you're in the right place at the right time, go do it. And, you know, he built it up from there. In 1963, it was my first trip to the Philippines, and I went looking for Philippine art. What was it all about? I saw 14th, 15th century Spanish European art. All the smart ones went to Europe and picked up the European new way of doing art, and that's when the abstract Ashcan school came alive. So, but what was here? There was an existing Filipino art, but there was no internet or someone compiling the data about the Filipinos who came here, who had artistic talent, who were writing music, making art. So it was here, but it wasn't recorded. So the statement that there was no art, in a sense, was false. But in reality, in historical documents and for the need for this to happen, Carlos brought it to the table. And he was there at the right time. So from then on, it was him. It was his mind at work. There was a little session we had down in Morgan Hill where we gathered artists. Then it grew to be the farm somewhere else. And, you know, all these things brought in one thing, which was he developed a sense of reckoning with his spirituality as a primitive, seeking out our native gut. And he put that to work and made it become an essential way of looking at us, working with natural materials, making it a contemporary art movement, art style, and now here we are looking at what he's done. I've heard people say, well, that's fashion. Well, it was fashion. You know, you had to go out and kill 1,000 birds to make that one cape. But, you know, these are the things that take place even in the old days. You know, the cloth, the capes in Hawaii. How many little red birds did they have to get those little pieces of feather? But there were plenty. You know, nature was plentiful. So did they really miss it? I don't know. The PETA people weren't around to tell us that. So, but the things that happen are for a reason, and I think it's the energy of what he started through World and Collision has to make this society wake up, and that fairity has to take place. And the arts, the creativity is something that is the best platform because we all learn to appreciate things we see. And if we're given the right tools to learn and given a path to go as guidance, a trail to follow, it's going to happen. But you have to keep the beat going. Leo played the drum. Keep the beat going, okay? Jazz was a big deal for us. You know, we still listen to the music. You know, we still sit in our studios and ponder and sit there late at night, not doing anything, just looking at the wall, looking at that blank canvas, looking at that piece of paper. You know, so, and I still do that. You know, so you just have to keep on going. Follow the path and he'll lead you there, all right?
Thank you so much. I do have a quick direct response to that because you're right, it is affirming the work that has been done by Filipino Americans here. And I was grateful to work on the reissue of the 1976 publication called Liwanag with Dara Del Rosario and Rachel Lastimosa when she was the Arts and Culture Administrator, part of Soma Pilipinas. So actually, yes, there are Filipino American artists who put together, in the Soma specifically, it's in the, if you see downstairs on the timeline, you see the cover of the Liwanag book, and some folks, Carlos's contemporaries like Oscar Peñarada, Jundis, and other amazing Sig Bilale were incredible Filipino-American artists. If you can purchase or I think get a copy from the library, you will be able to see the rich history of Filipino-American artists here. And yes, Johanna Poetic also is like some of the murals that I take my students to. There are so many artists here, and we are trying to unlearn how, at least for me, how institutions have embedded in me that there's a scarcity. We don't have to work out of scarcity.
One last question.
Mine is not so much a question as a comment or appreciation or reflection back. I want to pick up on Viet's invitation to make things crash into each other, which is just a paraphrase of that, or the things clashing into each other. And I want to invite my friend Kathy to have one last crash, which is a list crashing into manifesto. Yeah, so I just want to reflect your words back at you of dirty...
Speaking of crash.
Crash, boom, bah. Dirty laundry into versus compassion. And you always say that you're worried you're going to cry, and to see you, I want to say, perform that, which was for me not really a list, but like spoken word, was very moving. And I don't go around in life worrying enough that I'm going to cry, but it made me cry to see you laugh and demand your way through with such confidence that manifesto. And as always, I'm begging you to take your speech to print to be assigned. So thank you.
Also want to thank everyone here today, especially Rena, Kathy, all the organizers, you. I have a public service announcement. So following this discussion, local artist and performer Rachel Lastimosa will lead us in a second line light procession from Samsung Hall to the San Francisco Arts Commission main gallery for the opening reception of Carlos Villa Roots and Reinvention exhibition. The SFAC reception will go from 4 to 6 p.m. So please join us for that. And again, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again so much, Viet, Irina, and Kathy. We're not done yet here. Actually, we're gonna close off with a reading, a poet who needs no introduction, but I'm gonna give one anyway. So, so thrilled. Thank you for the panelists, and then another reading for us. Tango Eisen Martin is San Francisco's 8th Poet Laureate. Yes. He is the author of the California Book Award nominated Someone's Dead Already and of Heaven is All Goodbyes, which received a 2018 American Book Award, a 2018 California Book Award, and was named the 2018 National California Booksellers Association Poetry Book of the Year, and was shortlisted for the 2018 Griffin International Poetry Prize. Eisen Martin is also an educator, an organizer, whose work centers on issues of mass incarceration, extrajudicial killings of Black people, and human rights. He has taught at detention centers around the country and at the Institute for Research and African American Studies at Columbia University. Tango, thank you.
I go to the railroad tracks and follow them to the station of my enemies. A cobalt-toothed man pitches pennies at my mugshot negative. All over the United States, there are toddlers in Iraq. I see why everyone out here got in the big cosmic basket, and why blood agreements mean a lot, and why I get shot back at. I understand the psycho-spiritual refusal to write white history or take the glass freeway. White skin tattooed on my right forearm. Ricochet sewage near where I collapsed into a rat-infested manhood. My new existence is living graffiti. In the kitchen with a lot of gun cylinders to hack up. House of God in part, no cops in part. My body brings down to Christmas. The new bullets pray over blankets made from the old bullets. Pray over the 28th hour's next beauty mark. Extrajudicial Confederate statue restoration. The waistband before the next protest post. Hey, by the way, time is not an illusion, Your Honor. I will save your desk for last. You're witty, Your Honor. You're moving money again, Your Honor. It's only raining one thing. Non-white cops and prison guard shadows reminded me of spoiled milk floating on an oil spill. The neighborhood making a lot of fuss over his demise. A new lake for a Black Panther party. Malcolm X's ballroom jacket slung over my son's shoulder. The figment of village, a new news to a new white preacher. All in an abstract painting of a president. Bought slavers some time, didn't it? The tangent screeches of military boats and election Tuesday cars, a cold-blooded study in leg irons, proof that some white people have actually fondled nooses, that sundown couples made their vows of love over opaque piece plastic and boat action audiences. The Medgar of a second is definitely my favorite law of science. Fondle news clippings and primitive Methodists, my arm changes imperialisms. Simple policing versus structural frenzies. Elementary school script versus even wider white spectrums. Artless bleeding and the challenge of watching civilians think. Terrible, terrible rituals they have around the corner. They let their elders beg for public mercy. I'm gonna go ahead and sharpen these kids' heads and the arrows myself and see how much gravy spills out of family crest. Modern fans of war, what with their t-shirt poems and t-shirt guilt and me having on the cheapest pair of shoes on the bus, I have no choice but to read the city walls for signs of my life. Societies wander together like hopeful drops of a virus. Citizen testaments bent on offering me a nation of breadwinners to hold me back like it's a Brinks. I wrinkle the concrete sometimes like flesh. My Martin Luther King permanence turned away from a podium into the reeds like God is a dangerous twin. Black August to the mountaintop balcony on my bedroom floor. You know, they steal you from the earth itself and suspend you in your broken neck from their foolish euphoria. From the loyalty out to their great superstitions, loyalty out to their agrarian reform, I return to my mother completely disrespected for peeling the heat off of purgatory. They kill poets like me. Walk me away from my poems, never to be heard from again. In this final industrial complex of bloodlines picked over, picked through a sport and spiritual death of your devil at least half made, police become a pretty word. I'm reading a lynch mob shoestrings like they were tea leaves, teaching you how to write about cities. It's the 25th century in the mirror, people. Tyranny against your chump change, you're a chump to be mocked even with a gun in your car. A cubit of needlework spell tuned for the proletariat. The relapse ministry, talented people curled up in a fetal position next to a diamond dime. Just another service day in the theatrics of tea house fascism. In a bouquet of surveillance cameras, in the poverty of God, new blue eyes, courses of water, a newly potted presidency, and one big shiny coin if you ask animated capitalism and other non-literal voids killing his white freedom, the deification of hyphens, medicine bread and picture shows, great protesters in LA, guests of our ink, drop kicking roses in the graveyard, DC mink like a stone torn in half, the pen advances, despite CIA guideposts, despite non-African past and futures, a metaphorical but not surreal day in the horn-ridden life horn player improvising king. Like a radio prize fight featuring Shango himself, a real hand sweeps the land of racism. May I return to the ground? May I make progress with the gun? On our Mother Emmanuel, they put on music that evening. A swinging type body language for you to drink with fermented $5 bills. For your body language, some applause. My past stomach line ain't neither a good thing nor a bad thing, like being psychic on the way to a lethal injection. It'll sit you down with Lady Day. Lady Day leading youth who surrendered their souls to Africa too soon. Potty thought floating in the cup of water, she saved me. Accessing my stomach, accessing the love of the American lynched. Coat sleeves, wooden avalanche into the wrist, our Mother Emmanuel. Avalanche into the sharp keys, pain. The deal you make with pain. A piano makes sense for them. Laying hands on the world gradually. Addressing the bending necks on the streets of the north. Travelers sailing in pain, repeating pain in the north. 10 trigger fingers on that piano if harmony would have me. Putting 100 fights on every direction offered her. Lady Day leaning on trees again, recruiting the countryside itself, saying lay your plant out on this lightning, make your pawns a corner pocket of men. I've greeted the blues itself. America may clean my dead body, but will never include me. There goes the poet, killing without killing. Never mind this painting of your language. May I be a meaningful lynching, a crow's passing, good and dead by the afternoon. You know, apparently too much of San Francisco was not there in the first place. This dream requires more condemned Africans, or put another way, state violence rises down. Or still life is just getting warmed up, or army life is looking for a new church and ignored all other suggestions, or folktale writers have not made up their minds as to who is going to be their friends. This is the worst downtown yet, and I've borrowed a cigarette everywhere. I've taken many a walk to the back of a bus that led on out the back of a storyteller's prison sentence, then on out the back of slave scars, but this is my comeback face. I left my watch on the public bathroom sink and took the toilet with me. Threw it at the first bus I saw, eating single mothers half alive. They flew through the bus line numbered and on out the front of the White House. Hopefully you find comfort downtown, but if not, we brought you enough cigarette filters to make a decent winter coat. A special species of handshake lets all know who's king. What's the lifespan of uniform cloth? This coffin needs to quit acting like those are birds singing. Rusty nails have no wings, have no voice other than that of a white world dying. Their book pages in the gas pump. Catchy, isn't it? The way 3 nooses is the rule, or the way potato sack masks go so well with radio codes, or the way condemned Africans fought their way back to the ocean only to find waves made of 1920s burnt up piano parts, European backdoor deals, and red flowers for widows who spent all day in the sun mumbling in San Francisco. Red flowers, but what's the color of a doctor visit? There are book titles in the streets. Book titles like Hero, You'd Make a Better Zero, or Hey Fur Coat Lady, the President is Dead, or Pay Me Back in Children, or They Hung Up Their Bodies in Their Own Museums. Another book titles pulled from a drum solo. Run here, hero. Lie at the hiding place. All the bullets in 10 precincts know where to go. There's no heaven nor any other good idea in the sky. Politics means that people did it and people do it. Understand that when in San Francisco and other places that was never really there. I bet this ocean thinks it's an ocean, but it's not. It's just 60 Mission Street. All know who's king. King of thin things, you know, like America, I'm proud to deserve to die. I'm gonna eat my dinner extra slow tonight in this police state candy dispenser you all call the neighborhood. No set of manners goes unpunished. Never mind the murderer's insomnia or the tea kettle preparing everyone for police sirens. All street life, to a certain extent, starts fair. Sometimes with a spiritual memory even. Pre-dawn soul clap, your father dying even. Maybe I've pushed the city too far. My sensitivities to landfill districting and minstrel whistles, white supremacist graffiti on westbound rail guards all overcome and reauthored. Reauthored by revolutionary violence that chose its own protagonist, a muted stage of genius, the garbage is growing voices. Condensed Marxism for warrior depressives underpasses in their pockets because they just might be deities, a decent bid on the Panther name, or merciful Marxism. Disquieted home life, a metaphor for relaxing next to a person who is relaxing next to a gun. I stare at my father for a few seconds, then return to my upbringing. Return to the souls of Ohio black folk revolution down there pagan at this point. You know what the clown wants, the respect of the ant, wants to interpret pain only, wants to pull a 38 out of a begging bowl, wants me to hurt my hand on this pen. I'm not tired of these rooms, just tired of the world that give them a relativity. My only change of clothes prosecuted the government finally learned how to write poems, shootouts that briefly align, that make up a parable, or parables like white bodies are paid well. Do white men even have leaders? Are all white people white men? A rat pitches a river, can almost taste the racial divide, can almost roll a family member's head into a city hall legislative chamber, knows who in this good book will fly. All I do is practice, Lord. Decided not to talk out of anger ever again. Met my wife at the same time I met new audience members for our pain. We passed each other cigarettes and watched cops win. A city gone uniquely linear, Harlem of the West, do a true universe. I will always remember you in fancy clothes, my wife said. So here I sit, twisting in silk ideation. Rifle made of postbellum tar, targets made of an honest language. This San Francisco poetry is how God knows that it's me whining. Riding among the lesser respected wolves. Lesser observed militarization. Dixie List prison bookkeeping. I mean, the California Great Coast are coming. Lynch mob gossip and bourgeois debt collection. I mean, it's tempted to change professions mid-poem. In the Chicago briefing, the white sergeant saying blank slate for all of us after this black organizer is dead. Standard academics toasting $2 wine at the tank parade. Bail nothing, Lord, just nuclear cobblestones, gun line athleticism, and the last of the inherited asthma. Children giving white dolls to play within fear, facial expressions borrowed from rich people's shoestrings. I can hear hate and teach hate and call tools by people names and name people dead to themselves. No one getting naturalized except federal agents soon, carving the equator in the throat soon. I'm sorry to make you relive all of this, Lord, all of this pre-dime monarchy, friends putting up politician posters and snorting the remainder of the pace, minstrel script shoveling to the walls by the elders, my children sharpening quarters on the city's edge. For these audiences, I project myself into a ghost-like state. For these gangsters, I do the same. Every now and then, take a nervous look east. Sleep becomes Christ. Sleep starts growing a racial identity. Do you ever spiral, Lord? Has the gang age betrayed us? Be patient with my poems, Lord. So much pain, it's a point to crime. I mean, there has to be if race traders come with it, Lord. Is that my revolver in your hand? You know, better presidents than these have yawned at cages, have called us holy slaves, filled the school libraries with cop documentaries. Baby, I don't have money for food. Why? I have no present moment at all. Thank you.
Thank you all. Big round of applause to all our panelists and speakers today. And should we give Carlos a standing ovation? And with that, I'm going to invite you all to join us as we process to the Arts Commission.